We don't give a hoot. We don't give a hoot about saving your soul because we know that you can't die. There's not a chance in hell.
Did you know that when it comes to vaccines, physician training is nothing more than obedience training? You have to be indoctrinated into the vaccine mythology, which passes for medical training.
What steps can we take to encourage intellectual humility in others and in ourselves? In other words, how do we become more intellectually humble? In this lecture, Dr. Christine Laguerre will introduce us to research on social and developmental psychology and how these subjects might address these big questions. Dr. Laguerre is an associate professor of psychology at the University of Texas at Austin. She earned her PhD in psychology from the University of Michigan, and she is a cognitive scientist who studies the ontogeny of cultural learning. She examines the interplay of the universal human mind and the variations of human culture to address fundamental questions about cognitive and cultural evolution.
My name is Christine Laguerre. I'm an associate professor in the Department of Psychology at the University of Texas at Austin. I study how children learn and how to improve science education. Today, I'll talk to you about the development of intellectual humility. So there are these two competing drives that we really have to understand in order to study cognition. On the one hand, we are driven towards confirmation bias, towards seeking out information that's consistent with our beliefs. But on the other hand, we're motivated towards discovery, to acquiring new information about the world around us. And in this quote from Carl Sagan, he discusses this tension. It seems to me what is called for is an exquisite balance between two conflicting needs. The most skeptical scrutiny of all hypotheses that are served up to us, and at the same time, a great openness to new ideas. Now, those two modes of thought are in some tension. But if you are only able to exercise one of these modes, whichever one it is, you're in deep trouble. If you are only skeptical, then no new ideas make it through to you. On the other hand, if you are open to the point of gullibility and have not an ounce of skeptical sense in you, then you cannot distinguish the useful ideas from the worthless ones. So what you see here is that really the most effective way to learn is to balance between these two drives. Confirmation bias on one hand and discovery on the other. So what I'll talk to you about today is how children navigate this and how this is relevant to both science education and the development of intellectual humility. Now, what is intellectual humility? A lot of different ways that you could define this. The way that I've studied it is as a state of openness to new ideas. Right? This is highly relevant to discovery of new information. It's about being receptive to new information. And most crucially, it's about the willingness to revise beliefs in the face of inconsistent evidence. So true intellectual humility requires the ability to modify and revise things that you at one point thought were true. Now, how does intellectual humility develop? And how might we take the insights from research on cognitive development and how children learn and apply them towards understanding how to better develop and educate children about intellectual humility? Now, studying scientific reasoning in childhood provides insight into the development of intellectual humility. In order to improve children's capacity to discover new information and revise beliefs, we need to understand how children learn, how they generate explanations, and how they revise their beliefs when faced with new information. Like adults, children have competing drives towards confirmation bias and discovery. And I would argue that you need both of those drives in order to most effectively acquire new information. Now, how do we encourage discovery and openness to revising inaccurate beliefs? And how do children integrate new information with beliefs that they already have? Well, we know that a fundamental task for all humans, including young humans, is explaining why things happen. I think that explanation is a crucial feature of the development of scientific reasoning, and it's how we acquire and construct new ways of knowing. There's actually a very large and sophisticated literature on the development of causal reasoning that I think is highly relevant to understanding the development of intellectual humility. So, for example, we know that young children understand a great many abstract causal principles and have remarkably sophisticated causal knowledge. They can generate accurate explanations, they can engage in effective interventions, and they can make accurate predictions. So children have a lot of causal information. And not only that, they're deeply interested in understanding causality. They actively seek out that information in the world around them. We know that learning is an active process, so generating explanation is active. Young children spend a lot of their time acquiring information from the world around them, and are not just passive recipients. They go out of their way to ask questions and to actively explore and experiment with the world around them. They are active participants in constructing their own understanding. So to understand how learning works, how to encourage children to revise beliefs, we have to keep the active role of the child in mind always. So a large literature in cognitive psychology and educational psychology have discovered what's called the self-explanation effect. Right? So basically what they have shown is that children who generate explanation, children and students in fact, they learn material more effectively and generalize more readily to novel contexts. So there's something special about generating an explanation. When children explain events, they learn more than when just given feedback about the accuracy of their predictions. So there's something about the process of generating an explanation that has unique learning benefits. And these benefits are greater than when simply being told whether your belief or information is correct or not. Now, how does explanation guide learning? We know that there are these learning benefits of self-explanation, but what's the process by which explanation guides learning? We know that explanation imposes constraints on learning, so it guides and focuses attention on certain aspects of an outcome or process that are perhaps most relevant to understanding the underlying system. We also know from a lot of experimental research that explanation has distinct learning benefits compared to other cognitive tasks or processes. So for example, children learn more about the underlying causal mechanism of a system when they've generated an explanation than when they've simply described an outcome or observed it. Explanation also allows children to recruit their prior knowledge. So explanation organizes children's information and understanding into coherent conceptual systems. Explanation also allows children to identify causal mechanisms. And causal mechanisms are incredibly important for all sorts of reasons. But one of the main reasons causal mechanisms are important is that they allow you to generalize to new situations. If you understand the mechanism by which a system works, you can apply that knowledge to intervening and application to new situations and outcomes. So what I want to talk to you about next is how we've studied how children learn through explanation. And what we've done in this research is to compare explanation to other kinds of cognitive tasks or processes, such as description, observation, or active experimentation. So to do this experimentally, what we've done is we've built these novel machines. Now, these are simple machines that are meant to be accessible to preschool children. They're a series of interlocking gears with a fan on one end and a crank on the other. And when the gears are interlocked, just so, spinning the crank will cause a cascade of gear spinning that will ultimately spin the fan. And so the way we do this experimentally is we show children, we demonstrate how the machine works. So we spin the crank, they see the gears interconnecting, and it spins the fan. And what we do experimentally is to manipulate whether we ask children to explain how this works, we simply ask them to watch or observe, we ask them to describe what they see, or allow them to actively explore how the machine works. And we have a variety of different learning outcomes. So we assess their understanding of the underlying mechanism. We also measure their memory of the individual gears that they see. And what we found is that children that construct a causal explanation learn more about the underlying causal mechanisms, so the crucial interconnectivity of the gears in this case, and are better at generalization than children who engage in observation or description. So in one of our follow-up tasks, we actually give children similar materials and have them build their own machine. Children that have generated an explanation for how this machine works are better at building their own machines based on new materials than children who just described or observed. And what we found is that explanation has a great benefit for causal learning, but has less of a benefit for memory of perceptual features. So children that described or observed actually remember more about what the machine looks like than children who have explained, which would suggest that the learning benefits of explanation are unique and selective. Explanation really hones children's attention, guides their attention towards the underlying causal basis for the system, and has much less of a benefit for perceptual memory. So let's talk a little bit about intellectual humility and belief revision. We've established that explanation has a unique benefit on learning, and explanation is part of this process. And we know that revising beliefs or revising explanation is at the core of intellectual humility. After all, in order to be humble about what you know, you have to be willing to be wrong. You have to be willing to revise your beliefs. Now, examining constraints on explanation, I think, provides insight into the process of belief revision. What kinds of context and information motivate children to revise their beliefs? Right? This is a crucial part of understanding how the development of intellectual humility proceeds. So we know from Karl Popper that observation is always selection. It needs a chosen object, a definite task, an interest, a point of view, a problem. When we generate an explanation, we're always looking to explain something in particular, right? We're not interested in explaining everything. So a big part of what I want to understand and what I've studied is what motivates children to explain, what piques their curiosity. This is crucial to understand how to get children to revise their beliefs. We have to get them to engage in understanding in the first place. We know that explanation is a selective process. We also know that, like adults, children aren't interested in explaining everything. They're not curious about everything. Children are much more curious about some things than others. And if we want to optimize learning, it follows that we should know a lot about what children are curious about, what piques their curiosity and their interest. And examining what motivates explanation provides insight into the process of scientific reasoning and belief revision. So let's talk a little bit about what kinds of events motivate scientific reasoning, and in particular, motivate children to construct explanations. We know that children explain events that have the potential to teach them something new. So in particular, Inconsistency with prior knowledge triggers children's explanatory reasoning. Children are much more interested in explaining an inconsistent versus consistent outcome. And the quality of their explanation, the sophistication of that explanation for an inconsistent outcome is greater than for a consistent outcome. We've also shown that children's explanations guide their exploratory behavior. So the way children explain outcomes influences the sorts of behaviors that they engage in to test whether their explanations are accurate or not. We know that children preferentially explore inconsistent outcomes that they have explained. So there's a dynamic process between explanation and further exploration. So I think explaining inconsistency is in fact a really crucial mechanism for learning. Inconsistent outcomes pique children's curiosity, motivate children to generate explanations, which subsequently guide their exploration and hypothesis testing behavior. This generates new information, which feeds back into the kinds of explanations that they generate and the process by which they revise their explanations in response to inconsistent or new information. So to do this experimentally, we control children's expectations and beliefs. So let me give you an example of how we've done this using novel stimuli, these light boxes. So to do this, what we've done is we present children with outcomes that are consistent with prior knowledge, as well as outcomes that are inconsistent with their prior knowledge. We present those outcomes simultaneously to children, and then we ask them why. Why did that happen? To do this, we use a novel task with novel causal properties and categories. Now, the benefit of this design is that we have a number of different measures of children's explanation. We can measure what they explain first, the content of their explanations, and how their explanations influence the kinds of exploratory behaviors that they engage in. So here's an example of an experimental task that we've used. We use these novel light boxes and novel objects with novel labels. This is to introduce new information to children and to prime what their expectations are. So first we have a training trial, the TOMA training trial. And here we put a TOMA on each of the boxes individually. And what you see is that TOMAs appear to activate the box. They turn the light box on. Next, we have a training trial for blickets. And here we place the blicket on each of the objects, again, independently. And as you can see, the blickets do not appear to turn the light box on. Next, we have a trial where we simultaneously place one TOMA and one blicket on each box. As you can see, the TOMA activates the box exactly as you would expect, and the blicket does not activate the box. And we ask the child, why did that happen? Then there's another trial where once again, a TOMA and a blicket are placed on each of those boxes simultaneously. And what you see here is that the blicket does not activate the box. Again, totally consistent with what you would expect. But in this case, the TOMA does not activate the box, which is inconsistent with your expectation. And once again, we ask the child, why did that happen? And following that explanation, we give them an opportunity to engage directly with the objects. So once again, we can analyze what they explained first, the content of their explanations, and the kinds of hypothesis testing behaviors that they engage in, and their attempt to understand why that inconsistent outcome doesn't appear to work.
Nothing. This one's lighting up and this one's not. So that means it's making this light up.
And what we found is that explanation guides exploratory behavior. Children preferentially explore inconsistent outcomes they have explained. Children also are more likely to first explain that inconsistent outcome, suggesting that inconsistency piques children's curiosity and motivates their explanations.
Oh, it's because this needs to be like this, and this needs to be like that. That's why. Oh, probably the boxes are the wrong way.
We also found that causal explanation and exploratory behavior work in tandem to guide hypothesis generation, or the generation of explanation, and subsequent exploratory behavior, or hypothesis testing.
Oh, because the light goes only to here, not here. Oh, the bottom of this box has electricity in here, but this doesn't have electricity.
Mm-hmm.
It's lighting up. So you need to put 4. So we need to put 4 on this one to make it light up and 2 on this one to make it light up.
So what you can see here is the interplay of inconsistency, explanation, and exploration. You can see that this child respond to inconsistent information, and in that process generate multiple different potential explanations that he then explores or tries out. When faced with information that's inconsistent with his expectation, he revises his beliefs and tailors his exploratory behavior to understanding new outcomes. And there's an iterative process here by which inconsistent information, explanation, and exploration are all working in an interconnected way. So let's talk a little bit about explanation and the use of evidence. This is another crucial feature of the development of intellectual humility. Right? You need to be responsive to new information when revising explanations. So why do inconsistent outcomes trigger causal explanation more than consistent outcomes? Inconsistency is inherently ambiguous. Information can be inconsistent for a great many reasons. So perhaps uncertainty is what motivates the bias to explain inconsistent outcomes. So how does evidence impact information seeking and the interplay between explanation and evidence? So the way we've studied this, and this is in the context of a problem-solving task. So we gave children a task that allowed them to solve a particular sort of problem and varied the kind of information that we presented them with. Information that was either conclusive or inconclusive for a variety of different reasons. And what we found is that the kind of uncertainty matters. So ambiguous and inconsistent evidence increase information seeking, children's willingness to acquire new information, to a greater extent than consistent evidence. Children presented with consistent evidence engaged in the least amount of information seeking. We also know that information seeking increases with age. Older children seek out more information than younger children. So these are all processes that improve and become more sophisticated as children are older and have more experience. We know that more sophisticated explanations are associated with greater problem-solving accuracy, which suggests the process of generating an explanation is a crucial feature of how children revise their beliefs and how they actively acquire information from the world around them. So the interplay of explanation and evidence is really crucial to understanding how this process works. We know that children's reasoning is sensitive to different kinds of evidence. Children are much more sensitive to inconclusive evidence than conclusive evidence, suggesting that to capitalize on children's natural curiosity, we want to present information that is inconclusive, is inconsistent, etc. We know that children flexibly generate explanations for the evidence that they observe. So children are responsive to new information. And children use the explanation of evidence as a tool for problem solving. So the process of revising beliefs guides future action and structures the problem-solving process. It organizes information towards the goal of solving a problem. So the development of intellectual humility is about a state of openness to new ideas. We know that it's enhanced by reasoning about inconsistent and ambiguous evidence, which suggests that when presenting children with new learning tasks and new learning goals, The more you can present information in such a way that highlights inconsistency, ambiguity, or something inconclusive, the more engaged children will be, the more sophisticated their explanations will be, and the better their learning will be. We also know that the state of openness to new ideas is in fact reduced by consistent evidence, which has implications for education. Often the way information is presented to children is through a series of consistent facts. We know from a decade of research at this point that this is the least interesting way you can present information to children. You're much better off highlighting inconsistency and incongruity. This is what children are curious about. And we know that children are receptive to new information, right? Children are oriented towards discovery, and they seek out new instead of repeat information. They're interested in learning new things. So the kind of evidence impacts children's ability to revise beliefs in the face of inconsistent evidence. So the more inconclusive the evidence is, the more curious children will be, and the more willing they are to revise their beliefs, which again is key to the development of intellectual humility. And we know that children who generate more sophisticated explanations are better able to revise their beliefs in response to new evidence. So we should be paying careful attention to the content and the quality of children's explanations. They provide us with a window into the sophistication of their reasoning and problem-solving abilities. And changing how information is presented to highlight uncertainty and inconsistency will increase children's curiosity, the quality of children's explanations, the complexity of their reasoning, and perhaps most relevant to the development of intellectual humility, their ability to revise beliefs. The more we can structure tasks in order to benefit from children's natural curiosity, what they are naturally motivated to explain, what they're interested in, what piques their curiosity, the more likely children will be able to revise their beliefs in the face of new evidence, and the more intellectually humble they will be.
A major hurdle for intellectual humility may be our own cognition. Recent research in cognitive science has shown that humans are woefully prone to a litany of cognitive heuristics and biases. In this lecture, Professor Frank Keil considers what human cognition might tell us about intellectual humility and how heuristics and biases might be overcome and shape our ability to be intellectually humble. Professor Keil earned his PhD from the University of Pennsylvania, and he is now the Charles C. and Dorothea S. Dilley Professor of Psychology and Linguistics at Yale University and the Chair of the Department of Psychology. At the most general level, Frank Keil is interested in how we come to make sense of the world around us. Much of this research involves asking how intuitive explanations and understandings emerge in development and how they are related to notions of cause, mechanism, and agency. These relations are linked to broader questions about what concepts are, how they change with development and increased expertise, and how they are structured in adults.
This lecture is about heuristics and biases and the ways that they create intellectual humility or intellectual arrogance. And we'll start by defining intellectual humility and arrogance so we can have a working definition that will take us forward. We can define intellectual humility in three ways. First of all, we can think of it as an appropriate sense of one's present knowledge limits. This means knowing the extent to which one doesn't know. One's knowledge, for example, of facts, what facts one does know and what one doesn't know, one's ability to give explanations of how things work, and the sense of how well one understands various phenomena in the world. That's one sense. A different sense is an appropriate sense of one's future knowledge limits. That is to say, what one is likely to know in the future about how the world works or about how various phenomena occur. It can also be what one could know, and this means not stuff that one is likely to know, but one could know if one chooses to know it. So, for example, one might think one could fully master quantum mechanics, even though one might choose never to do so. And finally, another sense of intellectual humility, intellectual arrogance, is having an appropriate sense of one's cognitive abilities. This overlaps with knowledge, but can also include some sense of problem-solving skills, calculation skills, and any other performance-based estimates. What we mean here is that one might think one can think on one's feet very quickly and with great facility, but one might also think that one doesn't necessarily know more than another. One can just simply process information more quickly. Now, intellectual arrogance we'll think of as roughly the opposite of intellectual humility. It implies an inflated sense of one's present knowledge. One thinks one knows more than one really does. It implies over-optimism about one will know what one could know in the future. So this implies knowing a great deal about what the future is going to hold in terms of one's knowledge, but not being accurate. And also could include overconfidence about one's abilities, thinking one's much more able cognitively than one really is. But these aren't precise opposites. Intellectual arrogance may imply pride and social comparison, something that's not typically applied by intellectual humility. That is to say, if one's intellectually arrogant, one tends to think one's much better than one's peers, and one's very proud of that fact. It also has, intellectual arrogance, a certain confidence or certainty associated with it. One is quite confident or certain that one is intellectually superior to one's peers, but if one is intellectually humble, one may be not sure about how bad one is, may have great lack of confidence in one's skills, or be confident that one is actually quite inferior intellectually. So confidence and certainty correlate strongly with intellectual arrogance and not so much with intellectual humility. Now, one question that arises here is why there should be intellectual arrogance. It seems so socially undesirable, you can ask, why is it so common? If it's so unpleasant to be arrogant and it causes alienation in others, why do we see it? And there seem to be two factors. One have to do with social motivational constraints, namely that various tendencies to want to self-enhance one's own impression leads one to inflate one's sense of competence. But there are also, even if one's not motivated to think one is better than others, potential cognitive biases and heuristics that cause one to inflate one's knowledge of what one knows about the world, even though one really doesn't have that knowledge. And these cognitive biases and heuristics are where the focus of our talk will be, because they're particularly interesting. It could be that one really doesn't want to be arrogant, but one nonetheless falls into various forms of arrogance because of these biases and heuristics working in ways that often occur outside awareness. These two causes can interact. That is to say, social motivational factors may reinforce the biases, and the biases may make one feel a lot better, but they also are clearly distinct. So again, as I said, our focus will be on cognitive biases and heuristics, and we want to define these briefly to get a better sense of what they mean. We'll think of heuristics as shortcuts in thinking that entail quicker, computationally less intense processing, but sometimes at the cost of making errors. So they're shortcuts that are desirable because they reduce cognitive load, but they do often have costs associated with them. When those errors that we make are consistently in one direction, they're often called biases. Now, most researchers consider most heuristics to have some kind of adaptive value. They're there for a reason. We need those shortcuts to get by in our daily lives. One way of thinking about what's happening is what is called sometimes the attribute substitution model of heuristics, where difficult questions are often answered by substituting an easier one instead. And so one can think of this as trying to swap out what is a very hard way of doing a problem with a simpler one, but at a cost, because sometimes we'll have errors. And we'll refer to social motivational factors when they heavily interact with these cognitive biases, and that's often true in developmental accounts. When we look at cognitive biases and heuristics, we find that there are roughly two kinds. Those that can create either intellectual humility or arrogance depending on content. And these are ones that there's nothing intrinsic that causes people to always be inflated about their knowledge or deflated. It's simply an interaction with the particular content of what the bias is about. And yet there are other biases that continually create intellectual arrogance. That is to say, no matter what the content, they tend to make one think one's more intelligent or knows more than one really does. Those that consistently create intellectual humility may be quite rare, and we'll consider reasons for this asymmetry, why there are more biases that create intellectual arrogance and humility later. Now, one other point before we get deeper into the topic, the focus here is on general patterns, not individual differences. That is to say, it's quite obvious that some people in general are more intellectually arrogant than others, some people have more humility, and those individual difference variables are of course of interest, but that's not the focus of this lecture. Instead, the focus here is on general patterns that induce arrogance and humility in all of us. So let me talk first about heuristics that create either arrogance or humility. And this can emerge from any of the classic heuristics and biases that can cause either deflation or inflation depending on the content. If we think about it, there's lots of judgment and decision-making heuristics that could cause intellectual arrogance or humility. Base rate neglect, which we'll talk more about, the conjunction fallacy, which is difficulty in combining probabilities, the availability heuristic, which means that one relies too much on what comes to mind first, representative heuristic, which implies that we'd look at the most representative members of categories and assume they apply to all members of categories, and so on. There are all these classic heuristics and biases, and with the right valence and content, they can lead us to misestimate one's knowledge in either positive or negative direction. Then we illustrate with base rate neglect. The core effect is very simple. It allows local instances to overwhelm more general patterns of information. That is to say, one tends to ignore what might be a statistical pattern in a large population in favor of more local instances. Let me illustrate with respect to intellectual humility. Suppose I tell you that psychologists have discovered a test of severe spatial reasoning deficits. Now, this test has a 5% false positive rate. That is to say, 5% of the time identifies people with normal spatial reasoning skills as having a severe spatial reasoning deficit. But it's 100% accurate at identifying people with real deficits. And it turns out that only 1 out of 1,000 people have the severe spatial reasoning deficit. Now, given all that, suppose that you are tested as having the deficit, and I ask you, how likely is that you have a severe spatial reasoning deficit? If you ask most people about this, they would say, gee, I'd guess the odds are close to 95%. But the real number is about 2% because they failed to take into account that base rate of 1 out of 1,000. When we set up the problem this way, when it's a spatial reasoning deficit, we have a case of inducing intellectual humility. People are going to see this data, they're going to assume they're really quite inferior intellectually at spatial reasoning and come to the faulty conclusion because of this base rate neglect. So that's intellectual humility being induced by a heuristic, but you can also get intellectual arrogance by simply flipping what you're testing. Suppose instead we say psychologists have devised a test of extraordinary spatial reasoning ability. This test has a 5% false positive rate of identifying people with normal spatial reasoning abilities as having extraordinary spatial reasoning abilities. So now it's in the positive direction. But it's 100% accurate in identifying people with extraordinary abilities. Only 1 out of 1,000 people has extraordinary spatial reasoning abilities. Now let's say you take a test and your test is having this positive extraordinary ability. How likely is that you really have it? Some would answer that the odds are close to 95%, but again, the real odds are closer to 2% because people tend to neglect the 1 out of 1,000 figure. So here we have a case where the bias yields intellectual arrogance. The point here is that you can go either way depending on what it is that the bias is about. Now, many other heuristics could cause either intellectual humility or arrogance depending on the content valence. But the critical point here is none would represent a consistent pressure for or against intellectual humility. There might be minor pressure if the valence itself is biased. So perhaps tests of mental ability are more often framed in terms of extreme positive performance, such as various Mensa tests, in which case one might then be more prone to come up with intellectual arrogance rather than humility. But I want to focus most of this lecture on the classes of heuristics that consistently foster intellectual arrogance. So these are ones that, regardless of content, tend to focus or increase arrogance. And there are 3. General overconfidence effects, developmental overoptimism, and illusions of knowing, understanding, and insight, and illusions of explanation, all of which we'll call knowledge-driven effects. We'll focus much of our talk on the illusions of knowing and developmental overoptimism, but let me start with general overconfidence effects. These often arise, the general overconfidence effects, from self-enhancing social motivational pressures. For example, if one wants to think that one is intellectually gifted or particularly precocious or in some other way has intellectual strengths, one might engage in downward social comparison. What this means is one compares oneself to people who have less intellectual prowess than oneself, or at least one thinks do, and that makes one feel better. So it's often a strategy that people use to try to enhance their own self-image by trying to think about comparison cases that are clearly not fair in the sense that they're people who have more limited abilities. A related effect is what we call downward difficulty assessments, and this is where one tests oneself on tasks which are simpler than perhaps that are legitimate comparison cases. For example, suppose one thought one was a great computer programmer, and one tested one's ability to computer program by assigning oneself really simple computer programming examples. In doing that, one could feel very good because one whips right through them, gets everything right, but it might not be a fair comparison because one's assessing oneself with tasks that are oversimplified. It's when shown that if the task is more difficult than normal, and one constructs the task so it looks that way, or the people actually select more difficult tasks, then you can get the opposite, worse than average effects. True intellectual humility, one thinks, oh my goodness, I'm not good at all at computer programming because I can't handle this problem. But by and large, people tend to engage in downward difficulty assessments because it makes them feel good about their competence. All of this can also be propelled by other biases, such as the hindsight bias, which is the feeling that after one's done a task that one knew it all along, when one reconstructs the past history to make oneself look more positive. It can have to do with attribution biases, where if one fails at a task, one blames it to situational factors like it's too noisy in the room where I was tested, or there were distractions, or I was tired. But when one does well in the task, one attributes that to one's native abilities and says that's because I'm really competent and smart. And finally, confirmation biases, where one looks for evidence that supports the case that one is smart, and one ignores evidence that supports the case that one is not doing as well or doesn't know as much. These often reflect self-enhancement motivation, which is a powerful driver. People want to feel that they're competent and have great ability and that they're doing well compared to their peers. All of these can intersect with some of our cognitive factors, as we'll see. Now, a different kind of intellectual arrogance can come from developmental considerations. This comes from research showing that, in general, young children have a rose-colored bias about their futures. This was initially studied for traits and abilities, not for knowledge and intellectual skills. So, for example, if you describe to children a very young child who has shorter than average height or much poorer than average athleticism, is quite clumsy, or is very messy, and then you ask them about their future, what that person will be like when they're grown up, young children tend to think that the sky's the limit. They think this far below average person can become much taller than average, much more athletic than average, or much neater than average. And this effect seems to have it's argued to have a potentially adaptive role, what's called protective optimism. The idea is that young children are so confronted with their failures all the time, because they are often very much at the beginning part of a learning curve, that they might give up if they didn't have almost irrational expectations about future success. The idea here is that it protects them from failure and makes them keep persisting when they're doing so badly early on. This kind of developmental over-optimism bias for traits and abilities exists across cultures. It's been found in Japan and China and several other cultures. And it declines with age, so it's much stronger in younger children. And we can see that in the following graph. So in the classic study along these lines, if you look at this graph and look at the leftmost panel, the 5 to 6-year-olds, you'll see that when thinking about what an adult will be like who is shorter than average or less athletic average or really messy, they nonetheless think that that person will be extreme positive change. So that yellow bar in that leftmost panel means that the 5 and 6-year-olds are judging that child when they grow up to having very strong positive traits, having switched from being below average to being way above average. By the time they're 7 or 8 years of age, it's more mixed. Kids tend to think that a person will move to a medium level of competence, average levels of performance, so they'll get much better than being below average, but they won't be a peak performance. But then it changes rather radically with adults. Adults consider the poor individual who's below average in all these traits to stay stuck in the below average part of the continuum on into adulthood. They see consistency in the traits and not this positive change. So they don't have developmental over-optimism at all. If anything, they have almost a pessimism. So that's for traits and abilities. The question is whether this effect extends to knowledge. And could that cause intellectual arrogance? This might be different. It might not be the case that it works for knowledge, given the fact that young children often defer more to adults. So there's a pretty rich literature showing that young children tend, when they hear adults tell them things, to agree with what the adults tell them to a larger extent than older children or adults. If they're so deferential, perhaps they're not very optimistic about future knowledge as opposed to they are about future abilities. Well, to test this, we had them engage in a future knowledge task, where participants received 10 knowledge items to evaluate about what others might know at age 35, and then also what the self might know at age 35. We also had them evaluate knowledge at age 5 to look at the contrast. 2 items each were asked about in various domains: knowledge of complex artifacts, knowledge of biological processes, knowledge of natural phenomena, knowledge of psychological phenomena, and moral knowledge. We did this so as to get a sense of whether this intellectual over-optimism pervaded across all domains or was somehow restricted to some content areas as opposed to others. For complex artifacts, one example would be, how much do you think John, say at age 35, will know about the inside parts that make up helicopters and how they work to make helicopters fly? For biological processes, it might be, how much do you think that Tony knows when he's 35 about all the parts that make up trees and leaves and how they work to make leaves change colors in the fall? For natural phenomena, the question might be, how much do you think that Bill knows about the parts that make up thunder and lightning storms and how those parts make thunder and lightning storms happen? For psychological phenomena, it might be, how much do you think that Daniel knows about why some children are better liked than others and have more friends? And finally, for moral knowledge, it might be, how much do you think Mary knows about when it's wrong to ask other people's take other people's things without asking, and why that's wrong? When you do that task with adults, and this is a complicated graph, so we'll go through it slowly, as seen here in Figure 1, people's judgments of others' knowledge at age 35 shows the same kind of effect we found for physical traits and attributes. Look at the leftmost panel, which is knowledge of artifacts, and you'll see that the 5- and 7-year-olds, which is the leftmost bar, think that people will know an extraordinary amount about helicopter flies. This is judging someone else's knowledge. Older children are an intermediate value, but then adults think, no, they won't know very much at all. That's complicated, they won't grasp it. Then if you look for the next one over, which is knowledge of natural kinds, that is to say of thunderstorms or earthquakes and things like that, you find again this inflated knowledge early on, and then the knowledge gets less and less with time. The same thing is true for biology, the next panel over, and for psychology, although there tends to be somewhat more optimism about what people will know at all ages. Now, moral knowledge is different. Here, there's no developmental trend because everyone at all ages thought that moral understanding and knowledge would be automatic, does not require a whole lot of learning. It's something that comes in perhaps more instinctually. This is knowledge at age 35 of others. If you ask children and adults to rate their own knowledge at age 35 in the same domains, you get essentially the same effect, except that it's more inflated. So there's some degree of self-enhancement going on. Notice that the bar for the somewhat middle-aged children is the white bar is higher than it was in the prior slide. So you still see the developmental effect, but the children tend to persist somewhat longer at being over-optimistic about their own future self-knowledge. Again, the moral knowledge is right at the ceiling effect. So what we see is that for judgments of one's future knowledge, whether it's one's own or peers, children are wildly over-optimistic, and this can be seen as a form of intellectual arrogance. But is it really intellectual arrogance? They clearly think they'll know a great deal more at age 35 as well as at age 5, but does that have the same flavor as normal adult intellectual arrogance? And we might suggest that it does not. It seems perhaps to be something closer to intellectual exuberance, a great deal of excitement and over-optimism about where one could be, but less of a feeling of social comparison of being better than others. While there's somewhat of a small effect of rating themselves higher, the important thing to note is they rate other people very highly as well. So we can think of this as having just a feeling of incredible knowledge potential for everyone, far more than seems actually appropriate to older children and adults. Okay, so now we've looked at a couple of different ways that we can get intellectual arrogance, and now we're going to focus on those that are what we call knowledge-driven effects. And these are often illusions that arise from misattributing something you do know to thinking that it means you know something else. I'll illustrate that with the illusion of explanatory depth, and then I'll illustrate with illusions related to reductionist biases, and finally illusions related to the outsourced mind. So let's start with the illusion of explanatory depth. And this is simply the sense that one understands causally complex phenomena more deeply, that is to say with greater precision and depth than one really does. And it's measured by feelings of surprise at the shallowness of one's own best explanation or at one's inability to explain. Now, how do we test this? The way we do it is we train people up in what it means to have nearly complete understanding of how something works, medium-level understanding, or very weak understanding. This is one of the training items we used, which was to illustrate a crossbow. And we said if you had a level 7 understanding of a crossbow, which is the top panel, you could basically build one from scratch if you had the raw materials and the machinist at your side. You'd know all the details of how to make a really effective, strong crossbow. The middle panel, which is a level 4 understanding, means you have some sense of what makes crossbows distinctive, the trigger catch, the stronger bow, various other factors that make it more powerful, but you don't have all the details you have at level 7. And finally, the level 1 calibration, which would be scoring yourself as level 1 understanding crossbow, means you know it's something that shoots bows and arrows, but you really don't know anything functionally different between it and a classic bow and arrow. So what we did is we trained people up on this kind of understanding scale. We got them to show that they could get it, and they could rate 7, 4, 1, etc. for various bits of self-knowledge. Then we gave them a large list of new items to rate. We'd say, how well do you understand each of these following items on the same kind of 7-point scale? How a helicopter flies, how a zipper works, how a flush toilet works, how a cylinder lock works, and so on through a large list of items. We had them do this quickly, thinking that if we have them do it quickly, they won't have time to self-test their real knowledge. They'll just give us a gut impression of how well they understand it. Then, having given their initial rating, we'll call that the T1 rating, we would then ask them to explain 4 such items in particular. So we'd say, okay, you rated your understanding of how a helicopter works. Now, write out an explanation of how a helicopter actually works. As a result of having written out that explanation, we'd like you now to reassess your knowledge. So were you accurate? Did you want to raise it even higher? Were you even better than you thought? Or were you worse than you thought? And so they re-rate their knowledge. We call that the T2 rating. Then we ask them a critical diagnostic question, one that gets at the heart of whether they have a good explanatory understanding of how the various system works, such as the helicopter. For example, in a helicopter case, we'd ask them, well, how does a helicopter go from hovering to flying forward? And we find that in many cases this completely stumps our people, and they then, as a result of re-rating their knowledge, often drop it. That would be the T3 rating. And then we showed them a full, concise, but quite detailed expert explanation of how a helicopter works, and we had them read it carefully. And we said, okay, given that this is what is a really good explanation of how a helicopter works, what do you think your initial understanding was? How close was it to this? Was it still a 7 or a 6, like you said, or do you want to make it lower or perhaps even higher? That would be the T4 rating. Finally, having done all that, we then say, please study this expert explanation carefully and re-rate how well you think you know how helicopters work in light of having read this explanation. We did that last item for the reason that we wanted to show that we didn't get these people so discouraged they couldn't ever rate their knowledge as being high. And the typical results look like as shown on this graph. Focus your attention initially on the dark blue line, the upper line. The T1 rating is often quite high. Let's say this is a helicopter. They're thinking they know quite a great deal about how helicopters work. The T2 rating drops quite a bit, which means that after having tried to explain how a helicopter works, they're surprised at how little they know. The critical question, which is T3, causes a further drop down. So now when they're asked about how a helicopter goes from hovering to flying forward, they drop further. They stay low when we ask them to compare what they thought they knew to an expert explanation, but then we show that they can jump right up at the end. So this was our initial result in this task, and we replicated a number of times. But one thing that emerged in our studies was that depending on the background and expertise of our participants, the illusion was often stronger. So the top panel was a study initially done with grad students. We did it with undergraduates. many of whom thought that they would be much more humble, they were in fact more arrogant. So their drop is further. Their initial rating is just as high, but their actual drop goes down further down. Now, it's important to understand that the illusion of explanatory depth is not the same as other illusions of knowing. We find a strong illusion for ratings of how one understands devices and natural phenomena. Those are the two bottom graphs, so there's a strong drop. But if you have people rate their knowledge of procedures, facts, or narratives, there's very little drop, sometimes none at all. So for example, if you say, how well do you know how to make an international phone call, people are actually fairly calibrated whether they know how to do it or not, and their ratings are not that far off. Or if you ask them how well they know certain facts, such as the capital of Tasmania, they tend to be fairly well calibrated. Finally, even narratives, which have a richer structure, people tend to be better calibrated. If you say, how well do you know the plot of a well-known movie, such as Avatar, they're pretty accurate in their self-assessment of how well they know the plot. So this illusion of knowing, this illusion of explanatory depth, really is especially powerful for explanatory kind of knowledge, not for all kinds of knowledge. It's weak or not even present for facts and procedures and narratives. It holds for political explanations, so understanding how one can make political arguments or explain political effects, it holds. It also holds somewhat for evaluations of what others know, so it's not just self-enhancement. And it increases as people get younger. So you can do the same task in ratings of knowledge with young children, and the illusion is even stronger. We want to caution that it's not the same as general overconfidence, because the fact that it's much less for facts, procedures, or narratives suggests there's something different going on. So why do we have the illusion of explanatory depth? Well, part of the reason has to do with knowledge misattribution effects. What we can call one particular reason for the effect may have to do with a function for mechanism confusion. People often understand how to use things, and they think that's the same as knowing how it works. So you might be pretty good at using a cell phone and think your facility at using a cell phone somehow is indicative of your knowledge of how the cell phone works, when in fact that's not appropriate at all. This may be related to another form of intellectual arrogance that rises from what is called by David Dunning reach-around effects. And this is the idea that in a domain, you might think you have a lot of knowledge. So perhaps you're a member of a certain political party and you think you know all the positions for your party about global warming or immigration and the like. And because you think you're really gifted in owning your party's platform, if I ask you how well you understand another issue that is allegedly in your platform but it's just a made-up issue, you might think you know that as well because you reach around from your known knowledge to other knowledge that you don't really have and falsely infer you have it as well. There are even further reasons why the illusion of explanatory depth is so strong. One has to do with a relative difficulty of self-testing. This is the idea that we rarely give explanations, and we rarely hear full explanations. For that reason, there's relatively little data about how good we are at it, how good others are giving them to us. Explanations often have virtually unbounded depth. You can go deeper and deeper and deeper, and so we often rarely get a full explanation of a sense of its completeness or its quality. But you often hear things like facts or procedures being described in full. And finally, there may be something called the entity-present bias, which is the mistaken inference that one knows how something works completely because one can figure out how it works once in front of them. For example, if I gave you a simple mechanical stapler and I asked you to explain to me, how does that stapler work? You might actually do a great job with the stapler in front of you. You could talk about the springs, the push mechanism, the staples themselves and how they're advanced to the stapling location and the like. But if I asked you to draw me out a diagram of how a stapler works with none present, you might miss out all sorts of critical features and not be nearly as competent at knowing how it works as you think. So people often confuse the ability to decipher or figure out something on the fly with the object or entity present with having all that information in one's head. Well, there are related knowledge effects to the illusion of explanatory depth that we could also discuss briefly to give a sense of its breadth. One is the illusion of argument justification, another is illusions of insight. The illusion of argument justification asks whether illusion of explanatory depth effects occur for guesses of how well we can justify arguments. So if I asked you how well can you argue for global warming or for various other genetically modified food effects, you might have strong views about how well you can do that. And I can also ask whether caring about the issue mitigates or aggravates your estimates of how well you can make the argument. You might think, in fact, you might hope, that the more one cares about an issue, the more one knows about it and is well calibrated to one levels of understanding because one studied it and thought about it in depth and one's therefore better calibrated. So here's the kind of task we've done. We would ask someone, do you think global warming is caused by humans? And people would answer yes or no. And they'd say, okay, well, how well do you think you understand the argument for your side? So we'd say, rated on a scale, something like the scale we had before for the crossbow, 7 versus 1 versus 4, whatever. Then we ask them, how strongly do you feel about this issue? Do you feel very strongly about it or don't you really care at all? Great. So you've given a time 1 rating in essence. You've rated how strongly you feel about it. Now we ask you to write out your argument. Write out the argument, and then having written out the argument for or against global warming, for example, re-rate your level of understanding. What you find is something rather surprising. The way to look at this graph is that the upper line is the time 1 rating, and the lower line is the time 2 rating on a scale of 1 to 7. And the x-axis is how much they care about the issue. The first thing to notice is that the time 1 ratings, the average time 1 ratings, statistically average across all those dots, are higher than the time 2 ratings. So we have the illusion of argument justification. People think they can justify the argument better than they can, as shown by their subsequent time 2 rating. But you also notice that there's a bias that the more one cares, the higher one rates one's knowledge. So the more one cares about an issue, the more one rates one's level of understanding. You might think that's because they really do understand it better, but it doesn't seem to be the case, because we had third parties rate it, and that's this red line on the bottom. We see that the actual quality of the arguments is rated by third parties that these people made is essentially the same across all levels of care. So now we see something rather discouraging, that the more one cares about an issue, the more the illusion that one really knows about it, and the less one actually knows. So the disconnect, the level of arrogance, is stronger the more one cares about an issue rather than less. The illusion of argument justification, therefore, is propelled by many of the same biases as the illusion of explanatory depth, but it's further enhanced by emotional investment, which aggravates it. More generally, in other lines of work, we've shown that an argue-to-win mindset may induce more confidence about the objectivity of an issue than an arguing-to-learn mindset. It may make you see things as being more black and white and objectively true, and that can lead also to potentially a form of arrogance. Now, another way that one can have arrogance arises from what we call illusions of insight. And these are propelled in many cases by what we call a reductionist bias. This is the feeling or intuition that some kinds of evidence are more high quality than others, in particular, things that are closer to the physical and biological sciences. So there is a bias that we found in independent research to see physical and biological explanations as intrinsically more complex or meaty than, say, those at the psychological level or the economics level, even when there's actually no strong evidence to support that claim. And we find an effect of a rush of insight, a false rush of insight, occurring in a particular task involving cognitive psychology versus cognitive neuroscience. In essence, what we did is we described a study, and then we gave an explanation for the results of the study, and we either had no neural psychology data relevant, or we had some neuropsychology phrasing that didn't actually give you any insight, but gave this sense of insight. So the reductionist bias, and also perhaps knowledge misattribution, thinking one knows one thing when one knows another, might drive the effect here. How do we test this? Well, we described a study on the curse of knowledge. And the curse of knowledge is essentially the effect that if you take bits of information that everyone knows at roughly 50%, and then you ask people how likely that other people know this if they happen to know the knowledge themselves, they'll think other people know it as well. So for example, suppose you know the capital of Connecticut is Hartford, and you ask, how well do you think other people know the capital of Connecticut is Hartford? People might estimate that at 80% because they know the capital and they let their own knowledge leak into attributions about someone else's knowledge, when in fact it's actually closer to 50%. This is called the curse of knowledge. So that's the basic effect. And that's the study we described. We did several studies like this for our participants. We then offered explanations, but the explanations were carefully contrived. They were good explanations, which actually gave additional reasons for the effect and gave you some insight, versus bad explanations, which were circular, empty, and just rephrased the phenomenon. A good explanation of the curse of knowledge is the following. The researcher claims that this curse happens because subjects have trouble switching their point of view to consider what someone else might know, mistakenly projecting their own knowledge onto others. A bad explanation is this researcher claims that the curse happens because subjects make more mistakes when they have to judge knowledge of others. People are much better at judging what they themselves know. That second example basically restates the phenomenon. It doesn't give any kind of reason. So it's an inferior explanation. It's not as good. Now, in the with neuroscience cases, at the bottom panel, it's essentially the same thing, but we add in boldface information about brain scans and a particular brain region of frontal lobe circuitry. But if you watch carefully, this is not actually adding any real insight into what happened. It's just adding superfluous, uninformative neuroscience information. So, for example, it says, brain scans indicate that this curse happens because of the frontal lobe brain circuitry known to be involved in self-knowledge. Subjects have trouble switching their point of view to consider what someone else might know, mistakenly projecting their own knowledge onto others. Notice again that this brain scan addition doesn't really, this brain neuroscience information doesn't really add anything to the explanation. It's just kind of neuro-filled. So having given good explanations and bad explanations with neuroscience, irrelevant neuroscience phrasing, or no neuroscience accompanying it, we find there's quite a strong difference. When it's a psychological explanation that's circular or empty, and there's no neuroscience accompanying it, people are, in the left-hand panel, very easily able to discount it as a bad explanation. And so they rate it much lower than the good explanation. However, when you give the same explanation and you add neuroscience information, which is actually irrelevant to the explanation, gives no additional real value, it nonetheless gives this rush of insight. You're feeling, oh, it's grounded in the brain, therefore I understand how it works. And so people have this kind of intellectual arrogance in terms of this illusion of insight. That's a really good explanation. And that's the right-hand panel, where you'll notice that the negative depression of the bad explanation is largely alleviated. Our final set of illusions of knowing occur with what we might call the illusions of the outsourced mind. And this arises from a bias that's known as the individualism bias, which leads one to think that individual intellectual competence is much greater than it really is. Perhaps this is motivationally important for young children to not realize how incredibly dependent they are on other minds for getting around in the world. But even in adults, there's the tendency to assume that one knows a great deal more in one's own mind than one really does, and one tends to overlook the facility and ease of getting information indirectly. In other words, one often relies on experts or external sources for understanding how the world works, but one may often overlook that one's doing that and think it's all in one's head. This occurs often in transactive memory, where you have couples who might have been married for 40 years who fill in each other's knowledge gaps all the time, and the other member of the partner doesn't realize that this is happening. Perhaps when they go shopping, one person gets the vegetables, another one gets the meats, and they just assume they have that competence themselves to evaluate those pieces of merchandise when in fact they're relying heavily on the other person. You also see it in underestimating external knowledge information sources, and we'll see that in a second. So I'm going to give you two examples of how we get illusions of the outsourced mind. One has to do with understanding word meanings, and the other has to do with internet search. The misplaced meaning line of work relies heavily on an idea developed long ago by the philosopher Hilary Putnam called the idea of the division of linguistic labor. And this is the idea that we often know the meanings of words through hunches about who the relevant experts are. You think you know the meaning of gold, but in fact you may not be able to tell the difference between fool's gold and real gold except by deferring to an expert. So you know the meaning of gold, but only through a chain of deference to another mind. You don't really know it directly. You don't know the atomic properties that distinguish gold from imposters. Now, in a study that we did to try to test this, we gave people large lists of pairs of words, and there were 3 kinds of pairs. There were known similars, unknown similars, and pure synonyms. The known similars were things like wolf, dog, rowboat, canoe, seal, and walrus. The unknown similars were things like ferret, weasel, pine, fir, and blackbird, starling. And the pure synonyms were things like sofa, couch, car, automobile, and baby, infant. We'd give them a long list of these words all mixed together and have them quickly rate how many features they knew they could tell apart on them. The idea here was to look at their gut impressions of how much they understood the differences in the meanings of all these pairs. And we did it quickly so they couldn't self-test and actually assess them. And what you find is the following. The leftmost panel is the number of features they thought they could list for something like rowboat and canoe. The next panel, the middle panel, is how many thought they could list for things like ferret and weasel. And the final panel is how many thought they could live for true synonyms like baby and infant. What you see is they all thought they could list far few features for the true synonyms, which is of course accurate. We then asked them to actually list the number of features that they knew between them. The mistake they made was in thinking that they could list just as many features for the unknown similars like weasel and ferret as the known similars. When you in fact asked them to list the features, they were no better for the unknown similars than they were for the true synonyms. In other words, they know no features that distinguish weasel from ferret. But because they knew about the presence of experts out there in the world who did know the difference, and they knew that they probably knew several features, they displaced that knowledge into their own minds. There's a much more modern case of this that we've recently uncovered that has to do with illusions of understanding that are induced by engaging in internet search. One of the things about internet search is that when one looks at stuff on a search engine such as Google, one has instant access to unbounded information. And that instant and easy availability of comprehensive explanations and information may lead one to think that one knows stuff that one only can get through search itself. In other words, the boundary between what's in one's mind and what's out there in the world can get blurred, and one starts to think the stuff that one is searching for is stuff that one actually knows. You can intuitively get some sense that this is true when you think about what happens when you become unplugged from the internet. Sometimes for reasons that you didn't want to, you're perhaps on a vacation and the hotel you went to doesn't have internet service or it fails. You can, over several days, and you don't have good cell phone service, have no access to the internet at all. And when they start to realize that one didn't understand things as well as one did, and some knowledge one thought one had, one didn't really have. Perhaps one thought one knew about the plots of certain movies one was going to see, or one understood something about the weather systems where one were, or the history of the location where one's traveling, and all that knowledge starts to shrink down and one feels rather pathetic. In my own life, I've experienced this a few times when I was isolated by a hurricane or some other natural weather event, and I felt my knowledge shrinking almost on a daily basis as I realized how much I was dependent or parasitic off the internet for insight. So what we did is we did a series of studies to illustrate this point. We'd have one group of participants who had unlimited access to the internet to answer questions about how things work, like how does a zipper work? Other groups would answer this question without access to the internet, sometimes just off the seat of their pants, sometimes by reading it from a printout that was the same as what they'd find on the internet, but not one which they actually searched for. Then the groups were asked to rate their ability to answer questions on a 7-point scale. And then in the second phase, they all rated their own ability and an expert's ability to answer questions in 6 domains unrelated to the question posted in the first phase. So I ask you how well you understand how a zipper works. You look it up on the internet or you don't. You do this for a bunch of items. And now I ask you about items completely unrelated to those you've searched for, say how a flush toilet works and how well you think you understand those. What we find is that regardless of how we construct the task, in many, many different conditions, the internet group rates higher many kinds of knowledge. So whether it's knowledge about weather, knowledge about science, knowledge about history, knowledge about food, knowledge about the human body, or knowledge about health, people who've just engaged in internet search for items unrelated to the ones they're now being asked, nonetheless inflate their understanding. It's as if they think, oh my goodness, I really understand the world well, and this inflates their knowledge for things that they haven't searched for, but they still have this sense of access to the internet that makes them think they know things better in their own head. One question you can ask is whether they really think it's in their own head, and we've done a variety of follow-up studies to show that they really do. One particularly vivid example can be illustrated by physically instantiate what it means to be in the head. To do this, we engaged in what we might think of as a little neurofiction. We told people that when you understand something better, your brain lights up more. There's more brain activity. So we showed them these fabrications. These are not real neuroimages. These are basically colored in red images. And we said that when you don't understand something very well, the leftmost panel, you have just a little bit of red glowing. When you understand it better, you have more activation of the brain, all the way up to the far right, which would be level 7 understanding. Again, I caution you that this is not real data, this is just a neurofiction, but the vast majority of our participants believed it and thought this was a way of measuring how much you know. We said, okay, now they've just engaged in internet search, or they just engaged in answering the question without internet search. And we asked them, how well do you think you understand this as measured by your brain activation? Slide this cursor on the screen along the bottom until you think it corresponds to the level at which your brain would be activated when understanding this. So how much knowledge do you have in your own head is indicated by brain activation. And what you find is they slide it further along, they give a higher rating of their own brain activation levels after just having engaged in internet search. So regardless of how we measure it, there's a strong effect. People tend to see intellectual individual autonomy as far greater than it is. They think they're often lone wolves investigating the world on their own, they figure out things on their own, and they grossly overlook their reliance on external experts through deference, external sources, and the like. And this seems to be aggravated by having very easy access to instant information. 50 years ago, it might have been having an encyclopedia in the basement, but today it's having the internet at your fingertips. All right, let me conclude. There are many sources of intellectual arrogance, intellectual humility, many different cognitive biases and factors that can contribute to them. We focus mostly on heuristics and biases as opposed to the social motivational factors. And we focus especially on those that consistently produce intellectual arrogance as opposed to intellectual humility, because those seem to be much more common. In many cases, it's driven by knowledge structure and content. Knowing something tends one to make these misleading inferences and attributions about what one else knows. And sometimes these can interact with other biases as well. One of the challenges is that the plurality of causes of intellectual arrogance may make limiting it much more difficult. And so one of the great research programs for the future is to figure out ways that one can reduce intellectual arrogance without simply making people feel terrible about what they know. Thank you.
An important aspect to intellectual humility is being open to new information, a willingness to follow the evidence wherever it leads, even when it might be personally uncomfortable or when it might challenge our beliefs. In this lecture, Professor Victor Ottati will discuss the relationship between intellectual humility and the science of open-mindedness. Professor Ottati is a professor of psychology at Loyola University Chicago. He earned his PhD at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. And his research interests include research in social psychology, as well as interdisciplinary research in the areas of political psychology, cross-cultural psychology, and communication. His basic research interests include attitudes, persuasion, social cognition, open versus closed-minded cognition, affect and cognition, metaphor and cognition, nonverbal behavior, stereotyping, and prejudice.
Okay, the first portion of my presentation is entitled Open-Minded Cognition as a Chronic Predisposition. Here the focus is on a relatively enduring characteristic of the individual. People high on this dimension are open-minded, whereas people low on this dimension are dogmatic or closed-minded in terms of their style of thinking. So first let me say something about the relation between intellectual humility and open-minded cognition. Intellectual humility can be defined as an awareness of one's own knowledge limitations. coupled with openness to information, even information that contradicts one's pre-existing opinions or expectations. And so you can see that open-minded cognition is an important component of intellectual humility. Open-minded cognition can be regarded as a cognitive style, ranging from closed-minded to open-minded cognition. Closed-minded cognition is directionally biased. That is, it's a tendency to select, in other words, pay attention to, interpret, and elaborate upon information in a manner that reinforces the individual's pre-existing opinions or expectations. Open-minded cognition, on the other hand, is directionally unbiased. It's a tendency to select, interpret, and elaborate upon information in a manner that is not biased toward or against the individual's prior opinion or expectation. One reason to study open-minded cognition is that it addresses important practical social problems. Closed-minded cognition engenders political and religious polarization. We see some examples of political polarization, perhaps linked to closed-minded cognition in the present U.S. presidential campaign. And polarization, unfortunately, can engender political gridlock, conflict, and violence within and between states. Political gridlock has actually tremendous costs, which can even be financially estimated. It impedes legislation and produces economic damage due to government shutdown, which can lead to huge losses. Another reason to study open-minded cognition is more theoretical. Directional bias is a core theoretical concern in the social psychology of persuasion, stereotyping, and prejudice and impression formation. For example, stereotypes can elicit negative, directionally biased distortions of outgroup members, an example of closed-minded cognition. Finally, existing measures of cognitive style, those that already exist, often focus on the amount or extent of thinking. For example, you might be familiar with the distinction between systematic and heuristic processing, or the distinction between high versus low need for cognition, or system 1 versus system 2 cognitive systems. These all have to do with amount or extent of thinking. In contrast, open-minded cognition focuses on the degree to which thinking is directionally biased. So as I've said, open-minded cognition is not the same as a high amount of thinking. Now, sometimes open-minded cognition can entail a high amount of thinking. However, it's also true that open-minded cognition can occur when individuals use cognitive shortcuts that require minimal thought. For example, when deriving a political opinion, I might follow the advice of someone who I know is neutral and an unbiased political expert. Also, closed-minded cognition can occur even when individuals think extensively. For example, when considering a political proposal, an individual might perform a very detailed cognitive analysis, but exclusively focus, let's say, on the disadvantages of the proposal. So we developed a new measure of open-minded cognition. And why did we do so? There are some measures that already exist that appear to measure a similar construct, but as you can see, these previous measures often include items that do not specifically focus on what I'm calling directional bias in cognitive processing in this style of thinking. So if you look at, for example, the closed-minded subscale of need for closure, it sounds like it would measure the same thing, but you can see here that it contains items that do not really focus specifically on directional bias in thinking. Openness to experience, one of the big 5 dimensions, and also political dogmatism. As you can see, all of these measures possess specific items that do not specifically tap into directional bias in cognitive processing. So we actually created initially 3 measures. We created a measure of general open-minded cognition, but also 2 measures of domain-specific open-minded cognition. One is the political open-minded cognition measure, and the other in the religious domain, religious open-minded cognition. So we started out with 79 items that we drew and sometimes altered from pre-existing measures, or we created many of these items from scratch. Then using statistics, those of you who are familiar with statistics, an iterative factor analysis procedure, we winnowed down this pool of items to just 6 items. And then again, using a more formal statistic called confirmatory factor analysis that controls for acquiescence, the 6-item scale was formally validated on a separate sample. So here you see the items that we generated throughout this procedure. We developed correspondent items for the general, political, and religious scale. So you can see the first item states, I have no patience for arguments I disagree with. To create the political version of this, we simply inserted the word political where you see it there. And to create the religious version, we simply inserted the word religious where you see it there. Otherwise, the three versions of this item are virtually identical. The second item, I often tune out messages I disagree with. I believe it is a waste of time to pay attention to certain ideas, was the third item. I try to reserve judgment until I have a chance to hear arguments from both sides of an issue, was the fourth item. I am open to considering other viewpoints, was the fifth item. And the sixth item was, when thinking about an issue, I consider as many different opinions as possible. People express their agreement with these items, the extent to which they agree versus disagree with each of these six items. We simply reverse scored their agreement with the first three items, and then average the agreement with the six items in order to come up with an open-minded cognition score for each individual participant or respondent. We did the same thing for the political and religious scales as well. So, in concluding this little introductory portion of my material, open-minded cognition can be defined as a cognitive style involving the manner in which individuals select, that is, pay attention to, interpret, and elaborate upon information. Our analyses suggest that it is structured as a single bipolar dimension. That is, open-mindedness is the opposite from closed-mindedness. If you're high on open-mindedness, you're low on closed-mindedness, and vice versa. So it ranges from these two extremes. And we developed three correspondent scales, a general, political, and religious open-minded cognition scale. As I said before, when assessing open-minded cognition, we have three measures of it: general, political, and religious open-minded cognition. And when assessing relations with other constructs, we will look at all three of these measures. Before I look at relations, however, I wanted you to see mean levels of open-minded cognition for each of these three measures. As you can see on the left, which shows the mean levels of general open-minded cognition, in the middle, political open-minded cognition, and on the right, religious open-minded cognition, we have evidence of what we call slippage. That is, participants, individuals, tend to endorse open-minded cognition in the general or in abstract terms. But when it comes to more specific domains, such as politics and especially religion, average levels of open-minded cognition are somewhat lower. People are somewhat more closed-minded. Now I'd like also to look at the intercorrelation between general, political, and religious open-minded cognition. By the way, when I present correlations in my presentations, if a correlation has no star next to it, it means it's non-significant, which basically means it's essentially zero. If a correlation does have a star next to it, it means it's significant and meaningful. So you can see that the three forms of open-minded cognition are all positively correlated, as we would expect. If you look at the first column in this particular data display, you'll see that political open-minded cognition was more strongly correlated with general open-minded cognition than is religious open-minded cognition. You'll also see in the second column that 0.492 correlation indicates that people high in political open-minded cognition tend to be higher in religious open-minded cognition. But that correlation is not too high. What that means is since it's not a perfect correlation, some people can be high in political open-minded cognition but low in religious open-minded cognition, or vice versa. In other words, they're not measuring exactly the same thing, which is why it's important to have separate measures of these constructs. Interestingly, open-minded cognition is uncorrelated, unrelated to most demographic measures, okay? So in contrast to popular stereotypes, for example, if you look at age, old people are not more dogmatic than young people. Gender also, we do not see a tendency, for example, for females to be more open-minded than males. Virtually zero effect here. Although in some of our other data, we do occasionally get a small effect in the direction I just mentioned. Education, notice, is not really correlated with open-minded cognition. Being educated does not necessarily make a person more open-minded, at least in our sample. I should mention that our samples are United States of America samples. They are not necessarily fully representative of the entire country, but they are, reasonably variable in terms of age, religion, political affiliation, and so on. The only demographic correlation we see here is with place of residence. Urban and rural residents differ. People who live in cities tend to be slightly more open-minded than people living in the country, at least within our U.S. sample. Now, we then looked at open-minded cognition. How does it correlate with these other measures of similar constructs? You want to show that these correlations aren't too high, because if they're extremely high, it suggests you're really measuring the same thing that's already been measured. Well, you can see that it is correlated with similar constructs as we would expect. It's positively correlated with need for closure, positively correlated with a measure called actively open-minded thinking. It's negatively correlated with dogmatism and intolerance of ambiguity, which you would all expect in terms of the directions of these correlations, but none of these correlations are too high, suggesting that we are, in fact, measuring something a little different than these other similar measures. As predicted, open-minded cognition was completely uncorrelated with need for cognition. We were in fact delighted to see that this correlation was essentially zero, because need for cognition essentially measures amount of thinking. And as I've said before, open-minded cognition does not really tap amount of thinking, it taps the directional bias in thinking. This slide shows correlations between open-minded cognition and the Big Five personality measures for those of you who are familiar with personality theory. And you do see some correlations here. We see that open-minded cognition is positively associated with conscientiousness, emotional stability. The more stable a person is, the more open-minded they are, and vice versa. Openness to experience, it's positively correlated with, and agreeableness, it's positively correlated with. We then looked at the correlation between open-minded cognition and various political measures. As you can see, open-minded cognition is associated with support for democratic values, and consistent with some work by Jost, Kuglansky, and others, at least within the United States, open-minded cognition is associated with conservatism and Republican Party identification. Interestingly, you see there that political expertise is unrelated to open-minded cognition. So being a political expert does not make you immune from dogmatism. They're uncorrelated with each other. Another interesting thing is the zero correlation between political tolerance and open-minded cognition. People who are high on political tolerance are very strong advocates of freedom of speech. For example, even though they may hate the KKK within the US, which is an extremely racist organization, they may argue that they should be provided with the right to speak freely in public for reasons of freedom of speech. What this zero correlation means is that you can strongly value freedom of speech, but that doesn't necessarily mean that you are going to openly listen to the KKK and openly consider their remarks when they do speak. So these are two separate constructs, open-minded cognition and endorsement of freedom of speech and other political tolerance sorts of items. Here are some other interesting political correlations, but you see here, when we focus on the extent to which people pay close attention to politics, let's say in the media, their interest in politics, the extent to which they engage in a lot of discussion with politics. We see correlations with open-minded cognition, but it's predominantly just with our measure of political open-minded cognition in the middle column of this data set. But the directions of those correlations make sense. The more you pay attention, the more interested you are in politics, the more you discuss politics, you tend also to be somewhat more open-minded. Interestingly, when we look at the relationship between open-minded cognition and various religious measures, we pretty much obtained nothing. These are, as I said, since these have no stars against them, essentially zero correlations. This is interesting, in fact. This may be related to our particular sample, and we might be able to find correlations in other samples, but at least in our particular sample, we had, for example, anticipated that we would get a negative correlation between open-minded cognition and religious fundamentalism. We had anticipated that we would get a positive correlation between open-minded cognition and quest, as well as spiritual openness, because both of these tie into a tendency to be kind of open to new spiritual approaches and belief systems and so on. But we get nothing. It is not associated with fundamentalism, quest, or spiritual openness, and even just general religiosity is not correlated. What does this mean? This means that religious people, when you compare them to non-religious people, are no more or less open-minded. So there are no huge differences here. Open-minded cognition does predict some interesting outcomes, specifically empathic concern for others and more favorable attitudes towards minority outgroup members. So open-minded cognition is a measure of cognitive style, but it predicts empathic concern, which is the emotional component of empathy, which makes sense. The more open-minded you are, willing to consider another person's viewpoints, even if they differ from your own, the more likely you are to empathize with them, and the causality could probably go either way on that. We also see that open-minded cognition is associated with more favorable attitudes towards minority group members. These correlations emerge even when controlling for some of those other measures that are similar to open-minded cognition. So in summary, open-minded cognition is largely unrelated to most demographic variables. It's simply a little bit higher for people who live in the city than people who live in the country. When we looked at how open-minded cognition correlates with measures of similar constructs, we found that they were related and correlated as expected, but that the correlations were not too high, and so therefore our measure of open-minded cognition, while correlated with these other constructs such as dogmatism, need for closure, intolerance for ambiguity, is measuring something a little different. Open-minded cognition was unrelated to need for cognition, as we predicted, because it's not really assessing amount of thinking. It is positively related to conscientiousness, emotional stability, agreeableness, and openness to experience, for those of you interested in personality measures. Open-minded cognition is positively related to empathic concern for others, which is the emotional component of empathy, even when controlling for other variables, and also is positively related to more favorable attitudes towards outgroup members, even when controlling for similar constructs. Within the domain of politics, open-minded cognition tends to be positively related to democratic values, news consumption, political discussion, but negatively related to conservatism and republicanism, at least in the United States, that is. And then when we look at the relation between open-minded cognition and various religious variables, not a lot there. Not very many strong correlations. For example, religious people compared to non-religious people are no more or less open-minded than each other. So in conclusion, we can regard general, political, and religious open-minded cognition as distinct yet correlated constructs. And open-minded cognition is related to a variety of variables in a theoretically meaningful manner. The flexible merit standard model focuses on the determinants of situation-specific open-minded cognition. It assumes that open-minded cognition is malleable, that is, that it varies across situations. When we try to examine the determinants of situation-specific open-minded cognition, we consider multiple determinants represented by the many Ds on the left side of this screen. The effect of each of these determinants on situation-specific open-minded cognition is what we call mediated by in psychology and the social sciences, that the causal effect flows through like a causal chain reaction. A middle step, which is that it's mediated by situation-specific social norms that are activated in the mind of the individual. So you have a certain external cue which activates a social norm about what one feels normatively obligated to respond according to, which in turn elicits a personal level of open-minded cognition that the individual adopts. So here's really the same flow diagram, just presented in a slightly different format. The multiple determinants of open-minded cognition are simply the boxes on the left. The middle mediating step in the causality is labeled here situation-specific open-minded normative perception, because strictly speaking, it's the individual's perception of the extent to which they should be open-minded in that situation that we are trying to capture. Which in turn then influences the individual's personal level of open-minded cognition within the specific situation. So you see multiple determinants of open-minded cognition on the left side of this screen, represented by the boxes. In this particular segment of my lecture material, I'm going to focus on what's marked in pink here, the untenable message effect, which documents the effect of a particular characteristic of the situation. So first we had to develop and validate this now new measure of what we're calling situation-specific open-minded cognition, as well as a measure of the situation-specific perception of the social norms, the perceived extent to which individuals think in this situation one should be open-minded. So, and we also wanted to show that open-minded cognition is malleable, that it varies across situations, depending upon what we call message tenability, which will be more clear in just a few moments. And then lastly, to demonstrate that the effect of this situational cue, message tenability, on situation-specific open-minded cognition is in fact mediated by the activated social norm. So, according to our view, or according to what I should say the flexible merit standard model, social norms do not prescribe open-mindedness in all situations. Open-mindedness is perceived as virtuous or socially desirable in some situations. For example, if you're listening to educational experts discuss a new math program. However, open-mindedness is not predicted to, or not necessarily perceived to be virtuous and socially desirable. It's not necessarily perceived to be appropriate or virtuous in other situations. For example, if you're in a situation where you're listening to a group of neo-Nazis who are advocating ethnic cleansing, the virtuous, admirable, and appropriate thing may be to be close-minded and refuse to openly consider their arguments. Imagine if Rosa Parks were asked to openly listen to reasons why she should be required to sit in the back of the bus. We might regard her refusal to openly consider these lines of argumentation to be virtuous, admirable, and therefore socially appropriate. So sometimes social norms prescribe that it's appropriate to be less open-minded. For all of these reasons, in addition to measuring situation-specific open-minded cognition, how open-minded one indicates they would be in the situation, it's important also to measure perceptions of the social norms that are activated in this situation, the extent to which one believes one should be open-minded in the situation. So just to make clear, what we mean by situation-specific open-minded cognition is the extent to which one believes they personally would be open-minded in the situation, whereas what we mean by the normative perception is the extent to which one believes one should be open-minded in the situation. So we went about measuring these new constructs, which are situation-specific. But in fact, this measure is very similar to what you have already seen in the general open-minded cognition measure. For example, to measure open-minded normative perceptions, the first item was simply changed by inserting "in this situation" and "one should" into the item. So the first item becomes, in this situation one should be open to considering these viewpoints. And we did the same thing for the remainder of the items. But otherwise, the item content corresponds quite closely to the open-minded cognition measure that you have already seen. We then also created the situation-specific measure of open-minded cognition itself, the extent to which one personally would be open-minded in a particular situation that is presented to the individual. Here, we simply put in the phrase "I would" where you previously saw the phrase "one should" in the prior measure. We again validated these two measures using the same statistical procedure that we used when validating the general open-minded cognition measure. In addition, we wanted to validate that when people say "I would be open-minded," we wanted to make sure that they weren't just, pretending to do so in order to look good or appear socially desirable. So we wanted evidence that they actually do. And what we found in our experiment, the key findings supported this notion, which is that individuals who are high in situation-specific open-minded cognition are also more likely to pay attention to political information that contradicts their pre-existing political opinions. In fact, that correlation was a healthy 0.56 in our experiment. Exactly what do we mean by that? Well, there's two versions of this. For example, if we focus on liberal Democrats in this experiment, liberal Democrats who were high in open-minded cognition were more willing to read statements that had been constructed by conservative Republicans than were liberal Democrats who are low in open-minded cognition. Conversely, if we focus on conservative Republican participants in our experiment, conservative Republicans who are high in open-minded cognition were more willing to read statements provided by liberal Democrats than conservative Republicans that are low in open-minded cognition. So it appears that our measure of situation-specific open-minded cognition is not just people making up stories about how open-minded they would be, but actually taps into how open-minded they really would be, because it's correlated with how open-minded they actually are. We now get to the main hypothesis, which is that open-minded cognition does vary across specific situations and that it's malleable. We specifically tested this by looking at the tenable message hypothesis. We argue that in some situations, what we call open situations, people encounter a tenable message. This means people encounter viewpoints that do not blatantly contradict mainstream values. In other situations, people find themselves in what we call a closed situation, containing untenable messages. This would be a situation where an individual encounters untenable viewpoints that involve extremely unrealistic claims. For example, the claim that homosexuality caused Hurricane Katrina in New Orleans. Or when people encounter statements that blatantly contradict mainstream values. For example, if speakers are all arguing that minority group members should not be permitted to immigrate. The message tenability effect is pretty obvious. In some sense, it is the elephant in the living room when it comes to understanding variation in situation-specific open-minded cognition, although has never been empirically documented. The message tenability effect is basically that situation-specific open-minded cognition will be higher when you're in a situation where you're exposed to predominantly tenable messages than when you're in a situation where you're exposed to predominantly untenable messages. So, in order to test this hypothesis, we performed an experiment. Half of the people were presented with an open situation containing a tenable message, which was to assume you're listening to a panel discussion in which panelists provide reasons why all U.S. citizens should be permitted to vote. The closed situation, the other half of the participants were presented with, was assume you're listening to a panel discussion in which panelists argue that ethnic minority members should be denied the right to vote. This is pretty much outside mainstream democratic values within the United States. After being exposed to either the open or the closed situation, individuals indicated the extent to which one should be open-minded in the situation, and then also indicated the extent to which they, or in this case I, would be open in this situation. As predicted, when assessing the should ratings, we can see that the predicted effect emerged. People indicated that one should be more open-minded in the tenable message or open situation than in the closed situation, which is marked in red in this slide. Also, as predicted, when we looked at how they personally would respond in the situation, individuals indicated that they personally would be more open-minded in the tenable message or open situation than in the untenable message or closed situation. And furthermore, consistent with the flexible merit standard model, mediational analyses confirmed that the situational cue, in this case, whether you're exposed to an untenable or tenable message, influenced situation-specific open-minded normative perceptions, that is, the one should ratings, which in turn causally influenced situation-specific open-minded cognition, that is, the I would ratings, and we didn't want to just show it for one issue. So we did this 18 times in a follow-up experiment. Some of these issue pairs were political in nature, some were religious in nature, and some captured other topics. Here's a religious example. The tenable or open message condition. Individuals were asked to imagine that they encountered panelists discussing many reasons why individuals belong to religious groups, including forming social ties, exploring spirituality, honoring family tradition, and so on. In the untenable or closed message condition, individuals were asked to imagine you encounter members of a religious group who claim that in order to be saved from hell, one must give up their possessions and join their church in Montana, which, for those of you who don't live in the United States, is a somewhat remote area of the United States. For the one should ratings, in 17 of 18 issue pairs, we obtained the predicted effect. So the effect is really quite robust. People tend to indicate that one should be open-minded in the open or tenable message condition more so than in the closed or untenable message condition. All 18 of the issue pairs revealed the tenable message effect when we looked at I personally would be open-minded in the particular situation. And in 17 of 18 of those issue pairs, we obtained that confirmation of the mediational effect. So in conclusion, the situation-specific open-minded measures are both structured as a single bipolar dimension ranging from closed-minded to open-minded cognition. Situation-specific open-minded cognition is associated with unbiased information selection. Open-minded cognition varies across specific situations, and in particular, varies across situations that differ in terms of message tenability. This is the message tenability effect that we've demonstrated, perhaps the most fundamental effect of the situation on open-minded cognition, measured at the situation-specific level. And then finally, mediational analyses confirmed, in accordance with the flexible merit standard model, the situational cue determined normative perceptions of open-mindedness, which in turn determine situation-specific open-minded cognition. So here, looking at the flexible merit standard model, I'm going to focus on two effects that involve other characteristics of the situation that tend to activate the reciprocity norm. Specifically, I'll be looking into the reciprocal open-mindedness effect and the reciprocal politeness effect. In both cases, some situational cue activates the norm of reciprocity, which in turn has implications and therefore influences situation-specific open-minded cognition. First, I'm going to turn to the reciprocal open-mindedness effect in conversation. Here, we argue that there is a reciprocity norm in conversation that we all follow pretty automatically and intuitively, which is that we feel obligated we should feel obligated to be open-minded when we're talking to someone who openly considers our viewpoints, but not so much when talking to someone who does not openly consider our own viewpoints. So, in other words, if someone is open-minded when listening to me express my viewpoints, I feel normatively obligated to return the favor, to be open-minded when listening to their viewpoints. But if someone is closed-minded when listening to me express my viewpoints, I feel that I'm entitled to be closed-minded when listening to their viewpoints. So a very important situational cue is, to what extent is the person I'm talking to open or closed-minded toward me? So we tested this rather simple idea, again, in an experiment. In this experiment, participants were asked to first imagine that you're having a conversation with a person at a party. So this person disagrees with you fundamentally on some issue. Half of the people are put in situation one. In this particular situation, the conversation partner is open-minded. That is, despite the fact that you both disagree on this issue, nevertheless, your conversation partner tells you that he would like to take your ideas seriously, and it seems like he is carefully listening to you in an open-minded manner. The other half of the people in the experiment are assigned to a different condition or a different situation, situation number 2, where the conversation partner is closed-minded. In this case, the conversation partner that you're supposed to imagine you're talking to at the party tells you that he can't really take your ideas seriously. It doesn't even seem like he's listening. He tends to look at his cell phone and things of that nature. Later during the party, regardless of which situation you're in, all participants later during the party are told to imagine they encounter this person again, and suddenly this other person, the conversation partner, starts to talk to you, the participant in the experiment, and describe his viewpoints on various political issues. So now the question is, if you're the participant, do you think in this situation one should be open-minded? Is one dependent variable or one thing that we measured? And also, would you personally be open-minded in this particular situation? So the left side, we show the results for the one should ratings. And as predicted, we obtained the reciprocal open-mindedness effect. That is, if your conversation partner had been open-minded toward you, you returned the favor and were open-minded toward your conversation partner later in the party. And again, we performed a mediational analysis, and again, consistent with the flexible merit standard model, this manipulation of a situational characteristic, that is, having either a closed-minded or open-minded conversational partner, which is a situational cue, causally influenced one should ratings, that is, situation-specific open-minded normative perceptions, which in turn causally influenced I would ratings, that is, situation-specific open-minded cognition. So we obtained evidence just a moment ago, as I showed you, of the reciprocal open-mindedness effect. We then examined a more general but related effect, which is the reciprocal, what we call the reciprocal politeness effect. Again, the effect, we argue, is tied to the reciprocity norm. And the idea here is quite simply that although open-mindedness and closed-mindedness in some sense occurs in the privacy of our own mind, we still construe open-mindedness as a polite response and closed-mindedness as an impolite response. Consequently, the reciprocity norm, according to our view, will influence the degree to which we are open-minded even when we respond to polite or impolite behavior that does not specifically convey open or closed-mindedness. So, in other words, if someone is polite to me in any fashion, I will therefore feel normatively obligated to be open-minded when listening to them express their viewpoints. On the other hand, if someone is impolite to me in any fashion, I will feel that I am entitled to be closed-minded when listening to their viewpoints. We tested this second hypothesis again with an experiment. Again, all participants were asked initially to imagine you encounter a person at a party. Half of the people were put in situation one, where the person they encountered is polite. Here, this person they just meet shakes their hand, looks them in the eye, says it's a pleasure to meet you. He does accidentally bump into you at the party, but importantly, apologizes for doing so. He's a polite person. Situation 2, you're supposed to imagine you're in a situation where you encounter a person who is impolite. You reach out to shake his hand, but he ignores you. He cuts in front of you in line to get some food. He bumps into you. He does not apologize. This is an impolite person at the party. Later during the party, they encounter this same person who approaches them and talks to them and describes his viewpoints on various issues. So the question is, to what extent do the people in this experiment think that one should be open-minded toward this person? And also, to what extent do they personally say they would be open-minded with regard to this person? Again, we obtained the predicted effect. In this case, we call it the reciprocal politeness effect. Regardless of whether we looked at one should ratings or I personally would ratings, in both cases, open-mindedness ratings were higher when the conversation partner was polite than when the conversation partner was impolite, just as we predicted. And that mediational analysis was confirmed statistically as shown at the bottom of this slide. In conclusion, open-minded cognition varies across situations, as it did for the message tenability effect, but here it's across situations depending upon the type of person you're talking to and how they act. The reciprocal open-mindedness effect emerges if you are conversing with someone who's open-minded toward you. You feel obligated to be open-minded toward them, and therefore you are open-minded toward them. If they're closed-minded toward you, you feel as though you're entitled to be closed-minded toward them. We also obtained evidence of the reciprocal politeness effect. If someone is polite toward me, I feel obligated to be open-minded when listening to them speak. However, if someone is impolite toward me, I feel as though I'm entitled to be closed-minded when listening to them speak. These reciprocity effects that I just described on open-minded cognition are mediated in part by that activated normative standard. The earned dogmatism hypothesis is rooted in the assumption that different social roles possess different sets of normative expectations regarding what sorts of behavior and so on are appropriate. That is, social norms are role-specific. For example, a college student who participates in a group discussion that pertains to cancer is in the novice role. And because novices possess limited knowledge, social norms dictate that this individual should listen and learn in an open-minded fashion. In contrast, a cancer researcher who participates in a group discussion that pertains to cancer is in the expert role. In this case, because experts possess extensive knowledge, social norms dictate that they have earned the privilege of adopting a more strongly opinionated and dogmatic approach. Accordingly, the earned dogmatism hypothesis says that self-perceptions of high expertise can engender a more dogmatic or closed-minded cognitive style. So according to the earned dogmatism hypothesis, success elicits self-perceptions of high expertise, which activates a social norm that entitles oneself to be closed-minded, which then in turn triggers a more closed-minded response. In contrast, failure elicits self-perceptions of relatively low levels of expertise, which activates a social norm that prescribes open-mindedness, which triggers more open-minded cognition. So we've been hearing a great deal about the value of success and winning in this presidential campaign in the United States. This hypothesis points out that there are perhaps some costs associated with success and winning, specifically closed-mindedness and dogmatism. To test this hypothesis, we performed an experiment. Here we used a ease of retrieval manipulation. Specifically, participants were asked in one condition to simply name 2 political policies implemented by President Obama. Everybody could easily do this for the most part, and so people experienced success at this task. In the other condition, the other half of the participants in this experiment were asked to list 10 political policies implemented by President Obama. People had a great deal of difficulty doing this. Most people failed at this. Most people could only list 1, 2, or 3, and this is the failure condition. Afterwards, again, we had participants complete a measure of political open-minded cognition. As you can see, in the low expertise or failure condition, we had higher levels of political open-minded cognition, represented by the blue bar, than we had in the high expertise condition, represented by the red bar. So succeeding at the task elicited feelings of high political expertise, which as a consequence produced lower levels of open-minded cognition and increased dogmatism. So in conclusion, the earned dogmatism effect suggests that self-perceptions of high expertise, when activated by various situational cues, make us feel normatively entitled to be more closed-minded and dogmatic. That is, situations that increase self-perceptions of high expertise, for example, success, engender a more closed-minded and dogmatic style of thinking. So herein lies the trouble with success and winning. It can produce a more dogmatic pattern of thinking. According to the attitude justification hypothesis, individuals inflate the normative appropriateness or how virtuous open-mindedness is perceived to be when it is likely to reinforce their personal attitudinal convictions, but devalue the normative appropriateness or virtuousness of open-mindedness when it is likely to contradict these convictions. Paradoxically, then, according to the attitude justification hypothesis, open-mindedness can be biased, as I think will become apparent in a few moments. It's important to recognize that the attitude justification hypothesis and the tenable message hypothesis are not the same thing. Let me first describe in more general terms the tenable message hypothesis, just to remind you. Individuals, according to this hypothesis, adhere to conventional norms, that is, socially shared values, when assessing whether it's appropriate to be open or closed-minded in a situation. That is, an untenable message violates socially shared norms or values. The attitude justification hypothesis, however, says perceptions of normative appropriateness also can serve to justify the individual's pre-existing personal attitudinal convictions, their personal ideological orientation. Here we have some examples that highlight the distinction between the tenable message hypothesis and the attitude justification hypothesis. Let's look at the tenable message hypothesis. Here, a closed-minded reaction is perceived to be appropriate when listening to a message, let's say, advocating ethnic cleansing. In this case, one would argue one perhaps should refuse to openly consider this reprehensible message. But people would say it's appropriate to be open-minded when listening to a message, let's say, advocating healthy dietary practices. The message itself is either violating mainstream values or not. In contrast, let's look at the attitude justification hypothesis. An example of this would entail a conservative individual might believe it's appropriate to be open-minded when listening to a conservative message. However, a liberal individual may be less likely to believe it's appropriate to be open-minded when listening to the very same conservative message. So this has to do with personal attitudinal convictions, not normatively accepted and socially shared values. The attitude justification hypothesis, as I've suggested before, can produce a kind of biased open-mindedness effect, and in particular within the realm of political ideology. Specifically, when an individual rates politicians from the other side, from the opposing party or ideology, they will rate an open-minded politician as being high in normative appropriateness, extremely virtuous, and rate a closed-minded politician as low in normative appropriateness as lacking in virtue. That is, individuals, when listening to someone from the other side, the opposing ideological camp, will prefer an open-minded politician to a closed-minded politician in the domain of politics. But let's consider what happens when an individual is listening to a politician from their own side, their own party and ideology. Here we predict that this effect is less likely to emerge. They're less likely to say the open-minded cognition is far superior, more appropriate, or virtuous than a closed-minded politician who is terrible and lacking in appropriateness or virtuousness. Why? Why do we expect that this effect will be reduced or perhaps even reversed? Well, basically, if a politician's on my side, I might think it's normatively appropriate for that politician to dogmatically adhere and defend my position. So I tolerate dogmatism from people on my side, but I don't tolerate dogmatism from people on the other side. We performed an experiment to try to demonstrate this effect. In this experiment, participants in the role of perceivers read about information describing a political candidate who's in the role of target person. If you're familiar with the impression formation, we talk about the perceiver and the target person who is the object of perception. We selected for the experiment participants only those who were either liberal Democrats or conservative Republicans. We didn't have any middle-of-the-road people in this experiment. We also varied the politician's characteristics. So in the congruent condition, the politician's on the same side as the participant, whereas in the incongruent condition, the politician is on the opposing side when compared to the participant. We also varied the politician's style of communication. In one condition, the politician's style of communication and rhetoric was described as being open-minded. Okay, so the politician was described as someone who would listen to other viewpoints and consider viewpoints on the other side and so on. In the other condition, the politician was described as being extremely closed-minded and dogmatic and tenaciously sticking to a particular position, refusing to consider opposing viewpoints and so on. Okay, after reading about the candidate, participants rated the degree to which the politician's approach was normatively appropriate, virtuous, if you will. They also rated the degree to which they liked the politician, and they also rated the likelihood that they would vote for the politician. Our results supported the attitude justification hypothesis. When the participant viewed a politician on the other side, they preferred the candidate or the politician when the politician was open-minded to closed-minded. That is, they viewed an open-minded politician as more appropriate, more virtuous. They liked him more and were more likely to vote for him than if he was closed-minded. In the congruent politician condition or congruent candidate condition, this effect vanished. Ratings of the open and closed-minded candidate were essentially the same. They no longer said they preferred the open-minded politician over the closed-minded politician. Why? Well, being closed-minded was tolerated, and therefore there was less of a tendency to favor the open-minded politician over the closed-minded politician. Let's take a look at these results. Here we have the preference for open-mindedness effect, which shows the magnitude of the difference between the open-minded condition and the closed-minded condition for each of the ratings. The simplest way to understand this particular graph is that high bars mean that the open politician was preferred to the closed politician. This is the difference score. Whereas short bars that approach zero mean that the open politician and closed politician were rated approximately equally. Let's look at the left side of this picture. These are the normative appropriateness, or if you will, virtuous ratings. How normatively appropriate or virtuous did they perceive the politician to be? That blue bar tells you that when faced with an incongruent candidate, that is, when perceiving a candidate who was on the other side, they clearly preferred the open-minded politician to the closed-minded politician, and therefore the blue bar is high and large. The orange bar, however, approaches zero. Essentially, the effect disappeared when participants were rating the congruent candidate, the candidate on their own side. Why did this occur? Because the closed-minded candidate was no longer viewed as so inappropriate anymore, and therefore was viewed about just as appropriate as an open-minded candidate. We replicated this same pattern for the vote likelihood ratings and also for the liking ratings, right? If the candidate's on the other side, we prefer an open-minded candidate to a closed-minded candidate. But when they're on our side, this effect kind of goes away. It's kind of okay if you're closed-minded. You're rated about just as well as someone who's open-minded if they're on your own side. Essentially, what does this say? This says that closed-mindedness is not a sin when it comes from people of your own political ideology or party. In conclusion, perceptions of the normative appropriateness or virtuousness of open-mindedness serve at least in part to justify or promote the individual's personal attitudinal convictions. That is to say, paradoxically, open-mindedness can itself be biased. These findings have important political implications. Liberal Democrats often complain about inappropriate closed-mindedness and arrogance in conservative Republican politicians. Conservative Republicans often complain about the same sorts of traits in liberal Democratic politicians, and these criticisms may be legitimate in some cases, but we have to worry about these criticisms. That is, sometimes they may not be entirely objective. Sometimes people may be criticized for being closed-minded or viewed positively for being open-minded, not because they actually are that way, but because this serves to justify our personal attitudinal convictions. The fundamental characteristics of open-minded cognition involve the following. First, general, political, religious, and situation-specific open-minded cognition are each structured as a single bipolar dimension ranging from closed-minded or dogmatic cognition to open-minded cognition at the opposite extreme. Second, closed-minded or dogmatic cognition is directionally biased, a tendency to process information in a manner that reinforces the individual's pre-existing opinions or expectations. Open-minded cognition, conversely, is directionally unbiased, a tendency to process information in a manner that is not biased toward or against the individual's pre-existing opinion or expectation. When looking at some core relations involving open-minded cognition, we found that general, political, and religious open-minded cognition are all correlated with each other, as would be expected, but the correlations are not too extremely high, and in particular, when we look at the correlation between political and religious open-minded cognition, there's clearly room for the fact that they are slightly distinct constructs, that one could be high on one and low on the other in some cases. Moreover, open-minded cognition is related to a variety of other variables in a theoretically meaningful manner. We saw that it was related to a number of psychological variables, for example, openness to experience of the Big Five, political variables such as ideology. Most of these relations were in the predicted direction, but none of these relations were so high to suggest that our measure was measuring the same thing that has been measured previously. Turning now to situation-specific open-minded cognition, because we view open-minded cognition as malleable and as varying across situations, we developed situation-specific measures of open-minded cognition. Our research suggests, although not all of it was presented in my lectures today, that situation-specific open-minded cognition is determined by multiple factors. These include dispositional characteristics of the individual, personal attitudinal convictions, the attitude justification effect, role expectations, the earned dogmatism effect, for example, and various characteristics of the situation, such as the extent to which the situation contains messages that are tenable versus low in tenability, or the extent to which the situation contains cues that activate the norm of reciprocity, and so on. Moreover, these determinants of situation-specific open-minded cognition initially activate a situation-specific social norm that prescribes the level of open-mindedness that is considered appropriate or virtuous in the situation. And typically, individuals adopt a cognitive orientation that is congruent with the activated social norm. Therefore, the effect of these situational determinants on situation-specific open-minded cognition is mediated by the activated social norm. So, these findings are essentially consistent with the flexible merit model that I have been presenting throughout this lecture material. We have multiple determinants of open-minded cognition which influence situation-specific open-minded normative perceptions, which in turn influence situation-specific open-minded cognition.
How do emotions affect our ability to be intellectually humble? Plato's vision of the passions being subjected to the authority of reason is difficult to sustain in light of contemporary psychological research on the emotions. In this lecture, Professor Vasu Reddy highlights the role emotions might play in our understanding of intellectual humility. Professor Vasu Reddy is a professor of developmental and cultural psychology at the University of Portsmouth, and she earned her PhD from the University of Edinburgh. She is interested in the origins and development of social cognition, mainly in young infants. For 20 years now, she has been exploring the role of emotional engagement in social understanding, focusing on the everyday, ordinary engagements, such as teasing, joking, showing off, or feeling shy, which often get ignored in mainstream theories. She is the director of the Center of Situated Action and Communication, which explores ideas of context and situation on different kinds of psychological phenomena. Her interest in engagement as the route to understanding has led her to questions about the nature and influence of cultural engagement on social understanding. She is also the author of the 2010 book, How Infants Know Minds.
Hello. So today I'm going to be talking about humility and openness to engagement. This may be a slightly different angle on humility than what you've been hearing in this course, or whether what you've been thinking about it, if you have been thinking about humility. It's got different aspects. The first aspect I'm going to talk about is why not intellectualize humility. Because when we talk about engagement, it brings up all these messy things like emotions and people and changes and situations and so on. So why not intellectualize humility? Second, I'm going to start thinking about how do we understand engagement? How can we understand engagement? What does it involve? Third, I'm going to be talking about one little exploratory study that we did trying to investigate humility in relation to openness to engagement. And then I'm going to kind of conclude with how do we actually understand and relate both of these concepts and these ideas. Okay, so why not intellectualize humility? I come from psychology, so thinking about humility was an accident, but my background within psychology has been very much an attempt to understand the role that emotion plays in how people understand people, in how babies get drawn in to being part of a particular cultural and social fabric, and about how babies begin to understand people. And for me, the process is fundamentally emotional. So within that kind of domain, or within that kind of phenomena in terms of human functioning, the idea of putting thought first, putting the intellect first, or the idea of rationalism as the most important thing in understanding how we function seems quite bizarre. But rationalism has been very dominant, certainly within psychology, probably within a lot of the other social sciences as well. And John Haidt, for instance, has described the focus on rationalism as being like the emotional dog being wagged by its very little cognitive tail. Why does he say this, and why should we actually put rationalism into a very small, confined space rather than let it be the key to understanding everything human? Well, one reason is that if you look at development, at very many different aspects of development, people have generally tended to think about these aspects of development as being thought-led. Take self-consciousness. People think about self-consciousness as being that which children get when they are able to think about themselves, when they're able to have a concept of self. And yet there are other people who argue that's not where it begins. It ends up there, and that thought keeps developing, but feeding into that thought or into that concept must be a whole host of other emotional experiences and emotional developments. Or take moral judgments. We're all very familiar with this phenomenon that we pronounce upon the morality or the immorality of capital punishment or corporal punishment or whatever you want to call it, call them. But what usually happens in there is that we have a gut reaction first to any one of these phenomena, and then we justify them in what are palatable conceptual terms. And what's palatable varies from society to society, from group to group, and from age to age. So it seems to be, I would argue, and many others would argue, that emotion is the key thing that we need to understand in order to understand almost anything human, right? But what we usually do is resort to rational explanations. Now, there's something called Ngram, which you can find on Google. And it basically gives you a kind of a count of how many times a particular word has been used in academic discourse over years and years and years. And it's a really interesting exercise to look at the use of the word rationality and use of the word emotion over the last, say, 100 years or so. And what you do find is that the word rationality is actually decreasing in its frequency of usage, and the word emotion is increasing, rather slowly increasing, but it is increasing in its frequency of usage. And you might think, well, maybe the battle has already been won. Maybe we've already recognized that emotion is key. Not entirely. There's another reason why you might think the battle's been won, which is if you look at studies of artificial intelligence, somewhere in the 1960s and 70s, the attempt to create an artificial intelligence was led by reflective rules, right? And it's like that's been long abandoned now as being inadequate, because the reflective rules reflect what's actually going on in intelligence. They don't lead to intelligence. They are not the primary mover of intelligence. So, okay, so has rationalism already declined? Do we have nothing to worry about? Are we already good at understanding the roles emotion play? Well, I don't think it is. I mean, if you look at what is dominant, what is most frequent in terms of psychological publications, I don't know about philosophy, but I would imagine, actually, I'm pretty sure I'm right, that even in philosophy, it is the cognitive that is dominant. Okay? So you might argue, don't make a difference between the cognitive and the emotional, but we kind of do, and the cognitive very much tends to be dominant in psychology, in philosophy. It tends to be more prestigious, it's more analytical, it sounds better. It sounds more academic, doesn't sound wishy-washy. So there's something going on there which is stopping us from seeing these phenomena in emotional terms. This focus on thought and on the use of rationality has also been characteristic of traditional approaches to humility. So there has been a general attempt to think about humility as a thought, as a way of thinking, not as a way of feeling, not as a way of responding, not as a way of reacting, not as something you do, but it's what you think that we usually think of characterizes humility. Traditional approaches to humility also seem to rather focus on the self, right? So we think of it traditionally as a way of thinking, but a way of thinking about the self, okay? Not about other things. Now, this I kind of also find funny, peculiar, but I'll come to that in a second. So the traditional approaches, it's a way of thinking about the self. It used to be thought, say, 30, 40 years ago, that it's a way of thinking negatively about the self, of putting yourself down, of being definitely not boasting, but not just modest, but of actually thinking of yourself with some kind of a humbleness, right? Not thinking good of yourself. That's shifted. So people have now come to start thinking of humility as, okay, it's a way of thinking about the self, but not negatively about the self, rather more accurately about their self. So it's kind of putting yourself in a sort of a correct, truthful place in relation to other things or other people. It's also traditionally, a third thing, thought of as a rather special and saintly trait. Okay, so to be humble, you can't tell anybody that I'm a humble person, because that is kind of, it contradicts itself. But also not just that immediate contradiction, but we also tend to think of humility as something that's a bit rare, something that occurs in rather special people. So we talk about Nelson Mandela, Mahatma Gandhi, or Mother Teresa, and thinking, oh, that's humility. Well, there is an argument, and I would make that argument, that if we understand humility, if we break it down to understand how it looks on the ground, it's actually a very ordinary thing, and it's happening or not happening around us all the time. In the last 15 or 20 years, there's been a kind of a shift from what I said earlier was a very negative way of looking at humility as negative thoughts about the self, to a greater accuracy about the self. So the traditional criteria, the more recent criteria for humility, in June Tangney, for instance, she lists a number of criteria whereby you can identify what's going on in humility. You don't have to have all of them all the time. You might have some, might not have others. You might even have just the one, but these kind of help steer us towards an understanding of what's going on. And I'll list them so that you have, for one, an accurate assessment of one's own abilities and achievements. You have an ability to acknowledge mistakes and limitations in knowledge. Okay? You have an openness to learning from new and contradictory information and advice. You have an ability to see oneself in perspective as one in a large scheme of things. And you have, which for me is the most interesting, a relatively low self-focus and an unselving or a forgetting of self. I love this word because it's vague, because we don't really understand what it means, but it really opens up, it challenges us to think about what it might mean. So these criteria have shifted from the negative to the accurate, and they've started to bring in a few more, but I think not quite enough, of the emotional and the ordinary and the relational into our understanding of humility. So there's three problems, as I see it, facing how we understand humility now. One, is humility fundamentally an intellectual process? Is it a process based in conscious thought, or is that just our cognitivist bias in thinking about anything? Second, is humility really a trait, a characteristic of the individual? Is it inside the person? Is it really so stable and pin downable that we can identify these are humble people and these are definitely not humble people? Or is it something kind of much more diffuse and fleeting? Third, is humility limited to special situations, to conflicts, and to relationships, to special relationships? Or can you experience humility or its absence in ordinary, everyday encounters? What does humility actually look like on the ground? What does it feel like? Well, I'm going to be arguing throughout the next few episodes on this topic that there are, in our everyday lives, there are millions of encounters where we could meet humility or its absence. You show your Oyster card on a bus to the driver. You buy a train ticket at a counter. You buy a pint of milk at the corner shop. You pass a student on the stairs. You put your bin out for the bin men just as they come to collect them. You answer a call from the call center. Well, all of these are kind of potentially very difficult things which draw out at different times different things from you. Each one of them could go in different directions, and I think can bring out the presence or absence of humility, which you might sense for 2 seconds and then forget about them seconds later. There are options and choices and events that touch our daily lives, that depend on the fears and anxieties and preoccupations and moods that we begin with. They occupy our emotions and our relationships and involve often small doses of humility and arrogance, without us even knowing it, in the form of closing off encounters with people, and in the form of disallowing some conversations and allowing others, in the form of seeing the other that we're talking to, as a person, in the form of a person, rather than in some other form. So in the next section, I'm going to move on to what this other form might be. Okay, so in the last episode, we talked about trying to shift the focus of how we understand humility slightly differently. Just to summarize, we asked for 3 shifts of focus that we needed in order to get a better understanding of humility as a moving, changing, dynamic, everyday thing. And these 3 shifts of focus were 1, towards the emotional, towards understanding it first and foremost as an affective or emotional phenomenon. 2nd, towards the relational, towards understanding humility as a relational event between persons or subjects, away from the inside and away from the self. And 3rd, towards the ordinary, humility as present in everyday, transient, and fleeting situations. Thinking about this brings us close to what I want to talk about in this episode, which is engagement. Understanding engagement is not easy. It's a vague term, and we can define it in 10 different ways. We can pull definitions out of 10 different hats. It's not really going to help us pin it down. What we really need to understand engagement is its variety. How do we think about it? How do we see it? How do we experience it? And why does it matter? When does it matter in our everyday lives? Discussions have emerged in 2 particular domains, which have been known not to be revealing of humility in its practitioners. And one is in medical practice, or in dialogues between doctors and patients, right? And the other is between official representatives of government or social workers or care workers in some kind of official capacity, and their relations with people from other cultures. Okay? In both of these areas, problems of challenges to humility have frequently come up. Now, so it's not surprising that in these 2 domains, discussions have emerged about how humility really is important. And people take different lines, argue different things. One of the things that people argue about is there's a new concept which has come up and goes some way towards understanding engagement, which is an idea called narrative humility. Now, narrative humility basically argues that when you're in an encounter with a person from another culture, it's always other cultures, right? It's never us. When you're in such an encounter, what you're doing is not keeping your own judgment, but actually putting yourself out there in that conversation, not just listening to the other person create their story, but kind of co-creating their story with them without dominating them and without letting them out, so that they just are asked to do it, to write their story, tell their story on their own. Some kind of a participation in that dialogue. And now this sounds to me, engage with them, and then you get a good story. That's what it sounds like. Both of these things, in both of these domains, medical practice and in talking to other cultures, involve something in us about the way we see in that moment, the way we see the other as a person, and both involve a participatoriness, an openness to engagement, and a kind of a co-authorship of what follows. Okay, so there's something about engagement we need to understand. What is it? How do we think about it? Well, thinking about this, we've kind of tried to come up with some criteria for engagement. I'll list them for what they're worth. They definitely overlap with each other. They definitely perhaps tap into something more core and more central, but seeing them as slightly separate facets might help us understand what we mean by engagement and why it matters in understanding humility. Okay, the first and probably the most important is seeing the other as a person. Second, being involved, getting in there, putting yourself on the line. Third, not focusing on the self. Fourth, leaving a door to dialogue open so you can hear the other. That was 4. So now 5, appreciating value in the other. And 6, being attracted to difference. Okay. All of these features require some kind of an openness to connection, and it is really not necessarily conscious. So let's take that first criterion, seeing the other as a person. It could be seen as being linked to many, many discussions in the philosophical and indeed political science literature about recognition as a consciousness. People have talked about it for years and years. Hegel talked about it as he says you only are a self-consciousness because you have been recognized as a self-consciousness. I've got the words wrong, but it's something to that effect. William James talked about being noticed, as being absolutely crucial, and not being noticed as being, he called it the worst form of torture, because you simply cease to exist for somebody else. And Charles Taylor talked about it as a vital human need, and he talked about it in the context of understanding race and colonialism and whole groups of people having an inability to be and to relate to themselves successfully because they are not recognized by others. So seeing the other as a person seems to be involved in making the other exist as a person. The aspect I want to focus upon really in relation to this is in everyday and in relating to another person, Martin Buber distinguished something that he called an I-thou form of relating from an I-it form of relating. So for him, an I-thou form of relating involves me being utterly present in this moment of relating to you. So I see you as a thou. Right? I see you as a person and I'm talking to. And I am not thinking of you as, oh, that's the audience hidden behind the camera, or that's the camera person signaling to me not to make too many gestures. I'm seeing you without the filter of all these things, without categorizing you as something, making you a subject rather than an object. I don't see you through another agenda. I've got to entertain the audience. I just am there with you in the moment, and I see you as a thou. I don't exclude your subjectivity, and I adopt what has come to be called a second-person stance towards you. So if I see you as a thou, as a you, basically, rather than a he or she is sitting there behind the camera, I am talking to you in the second person, right? Not in the third person, not referring to you as a person out there, but actually directly addressing you. And this, in so many different ways, I'm biased towards understanding human development and babies, but in so many different ways, it makes a phenomenal difference being addressed as a you. It draws things out of you, it allows things to happen, and so on. Think about examples where not seeing the other as a person is very common, but also can be quite damaging. Student passes you on the stairs, you're so busy thinking of the meeting that you've got to get to. All you see on the stairs is student after student passing. You don't see the person. After you pass, you suddenly realize, damn, they were looking at me and kind of saying hello and kind of expecting me to respond to them. You haven't seen it. And it's okay, it's a momentary damage. Probably they're not going to go home and cry about it, but it could be damaging. You have elections coming up and you open the door to a knock and you see a member of another political party. What do you see? You really don't see the person standing there. You see the blue of the label. You see a person representing a category of persons. You do not see the person. Now, you're not going to open your heart out to this person. You're going to talk to them very much through this filter of this label and this category. Happens very often in medical communications. I mean, there are examples galore where people talk about doctors rushing in saying, I don't have time to explain now, let me just get on with this. Now, obviously, in cases of emergency, you really want that to happen, but in other cases, people are pushed aside and feel small, they feel demeaned, they feel belittled by that kind of deprioritization because they don't exist as a person, they exist as a patient. There's another example, which I'm kind of intrigued by, and I've talked about it at other times. It's in Anna Karenina, in Tolstoy's Anna Karenina. And so there's this man, this kind of rather boring, disciplined man called Karenin, who's married to this beautiful, much younger, vivacious Anna, and his wife is young, she's popular, she's lovely, she's a good, dutiful wife. But one evening at a party, she spends rather a long time talking to this handsome young soldier, and he feels a bit uncomfortable. He goes off home, this Mr. Karenin, and prepares himself for telling her when she comes home not to spend so much time talking to handsome young men. Now, as he's because he doesn't really doubt her, he trusts her, etc., etc. But as he's preparing himself, he has a momentary glimpse of perhaps he's wrong, perhaps there is something in her that he hadn't actually recognized before. And I'll just read you the words. For the first time, he vividly conjured up her personal life, her thoughts, her wishes, and the idea that she might, even must, have a personal life all her own was so frightening that he hastened to drive it away. This was the chasm into which he dared not look. Okay, he was a bit of an extreme, dried up kind of person, but he wasn't unusually arrogant. He wanted to connect with her. She comes home, okay? And here's where this kind of fleeting swapping of roles happens. She comes home full of being enlivened by this encounter with this young man whom later on she has an affair with and so on, but that's not yet on the cards. That's not yet happened. She comes home, he gently broaches this topic with her, and she puts up a wall. Said, what's the problem? Well, there isn't anything wrong, etc., etc. And he, despite his closing off of her consciousness to himself, to his consciousness, despite that, in that moment of her putting up this denial of his concerns, immediately recognized there's something going on, right? She, normally a very humble, easygoing, non-arrogant person, in that moment of casting him off as, oh, he's just cold and unfeeling, is absolutely being arrogant. She's categorizing him into this category of a painful husband. And we're probably familiar in our own lives with many examples when we've had argument after argument within relationships, a sibling, a parent, a husband, a partner, and so on and so forth, where out of sheer exhaustion, we shut the doors. We stop seeing them as persons. And it's kind of like that's the only thing we can do because we're only human and we have limited sources of energy to deal with the emotions we have. The point about here is, yes, it is about seeing the other as a person, but it is very, very much rooted in how you feel at the moment and long term. Okay, that was criterion 1, seeing the other as a person. And as I said, it is really probably the most significant one. I'll do one more, and this one is about being involved. You can't engage with someone without putting yourself on the line, without getting in there with them. You can't engage to order. You can't teach somebody to engage, actually. You can try. But what it requires is that they instantiate, they realize that by being present in the moment with the other person. There's 2 issues going on here in understanding what it means to be involved and why this is actually relevant to understanding humility. One is that genuine involvement requires some degree of honest expression of the self, some degree of being present to the other person oneself. Right? It's some degree of showing oneself to the other. And second, there is a necessary circularity between the involvement of yourself, how much you put yourself on the line, and how much the other gets involved with you. So if you think about examples, let's say somebody's given you a very, very special holiday, right? And you don't like it. And they ask you, so how did you like that? And you can deal with it in a number of different ways. The easiest one that we usually have recourse to is saying, oh, it was lovely, thank you very much, right? It's a weird thing to say because A, you're being dishonest, B, you're shutting off the possibility of further discussion with it, some degree of opening up a door to it. Yeah, it was, but I had this problem, or I felt this, etc., would actually A, allow more engagement and discussion about it, and B, stop you from seeing the other person as somebody with such bad taste or such weirdnesses that they think that you would like this, and so on. It's not that you've had those thoughts before. Those thoughts could emerge from the fact of shutting off dialogue. Take another example. A teenage son, right? You ask him a question and he rolls his eyes and he goes up to his room. Okay? It may not be a very big thing, but it is extremely damaging in the relationship. It's extremely hurtful to you. All it's doing is actually saying, I am not getting involved with you. Okay. Take the example of a young colleague. I mean, I've had experiences of this where being around in a particular profession for years and years and years, you see things come and go and come back again and go again and so on. Now you have younger colleagues try to fight the same battles and try to bring up the same new ideas again and again. And you might say something that won't work because, and the young colleague knows that they don't have the power to influence you perhaps, and they say, oh, whatever. And they give up. And you're trying to explain something and the young colleague says, whatever. What's happening there? It's a cutting off. They are not going to get into discussion with you. And what that's doing is shutting the door to engagement. And it's also absolutely calling up the possibility of humility and arrogance. Being involved is, it involves a mutuality. It sees the other as a subject you're in relation with, not merely as a subject whom you intellectually know. So, for example, if you do interviews with people, right, the standard line in how to do interviews is, don't put your own views out there. You have to do the interview to get their views, but you can't do interviews like that. An interview, some people have described it as a mutual citing, that if you don't cite them, they can't cite you, and vice versa. So there's got to be a connection there for truth to emerge, right? This is not the way in which we normally understand things. We understand things by put it under the microscope, let's not get involved, let's understand it better. But many things don't work like that. In fact, you ruin the very phenomenon that you're trying to understand. And in infants, as in adults, there are huge differences in how brains respond to being put on the spot. If somebody else is actually putting them on the spot and talking to you, brains respond differently, the body responds differently, emotions are aroused very differently. So something in terms of being seen as a person and having the other person be involved with you, not just looking at you, is crucial to how we understand what happens next. Okay, so in the last episode, we were talking about different criteria for engagement, which the criteria may overlap with each other and draw on each other, but they're different aspects and they're kind of useful to help us understand engagement. And we spoke about two. One is this very central thing about seeing the other person as a person, and the second was being involved yourself in the seeing in order to see and in order to engage. So there's 4 other criteria left that I listed. And the third one is not focusing on the self. Now, you don't just engage with people, you also engage with anything, with things, with sunsets and with toys and with the wind in your face as you ride on a bicycle, or with the movement of the clay as you're throwing a pot. It's my new passion. But somewhere in all of these kinds of engagement, including the engagement with persons, some people argue that what's really necessary is a blurring of the sense of self and the sense of other, where the relation between you or the situation, the moment, becomes primary, rather than I am enjoying this bike ride, or I am enjoying the feeling of this clay, or isn't that a beautiful sunset out there? There have been studies looking at how runners, regular runners on a very particularly beautiful beach in Australia, describe the kinds of feelings they have of the grandeur and beauty of the scenery when they're completely lost in it and are not exactly observing it, right? And this distinction has been referred to as a kind of an ecological awareness of the beauty of the scene, of the other person, where you are in it. You're in that relation, as opposed to outside of that relation, observing it. And it would seem that in order really for engagement to be rich, to lead somewhere, to be fulfilling, to mean something to both, you and I kind of have to be in there in that moment together. Okay. Sometimes this is easy. There's fluency and there's harmony in this relation of self and other person. Let me go back to persons because that's kind of what we're talking about mainly. Where we are conscious of being, you don't lose the consciousness that you are, but you're also consciousness of the other, but without a particular focus on yourself. You're conscious, if you like, of the space between you and the other. And sometimes when this happens, I don't know whether you've ever experienced this. You're having a conversation with someone, and you've got very half-baked thoughts popping up in your head. But because that conversation has, for some reason, been going really well, your half-baked thought is picked up by the other person and enlarged, built up a little bit more, and you can latch on, and a new thought is born of the fact of that other person perceiving your thought, and so on and so forth. It can be a feeling, it can be how you relate physically to each other, emotionally, with ideas, in whatever way. But sometimes this kind of fluency of relation leads to richer ways that simply could not have been predicted, and it's very easy. At other times, and they're rare, those moments, and you treasure them when they happen, but at other times, you need to make an effort to jump to focus on the other, to focus away from yourself. And that can be for a number of different reasons, because you're so anxious, because you're so afraid, because you're so angry. I was watching, in one of my weaker couch potato moments, a Jeremy Kyle show where there was this mother and daughter, and if I remember correctly, the mother was really angry, and that's why they came onto the show. The mother was really angry because the daughter, she said, had stolen some jewelry, and this guy this Jeremy Kyle guy had behind the scenes knowledge that what was actually happening with this teenage daughter was that she'd been sexually abused by someone significant. Now, the mother didn't know this, and in order to fix the relationship, he reveals it in the moment. But even with that incredible revelation of something in her family, to her daughter, in her house, the mother was so protected by the emotion that she was so intensely feeling. She couldn't give anything other than a kind of a cursory, "Oh, is that so? But she stole my jewelry." Okay, and okay, this is an extreme case, but in many more minor cases, you see it all the time. Your son comes in wanting to show you some flower that he's picked up from the garden, and he traipses mud all over the kitchen floor and you're in a rush, you're trying to get the tea ready, you're trying to do this, that, and the other. All you can see is the mud. What you're doing is focusing on self. So it's a kind of a very common thing, this being unable to get away from the self. And sometimes we need it to protect our own illusion of competence. Kids do it too. No, I didn't get it wrong. I did it that way. You tell fibs to kind of protect your ego and to protect sometimes shaky beliefs. Let's say you have an academic theory and you're trying to argue this in a conference. Somebody challenges it, and you can kind of see a glimmer of like, oh no, that's a point. But what you do, because you're so afraid or because you feel so vulnerable, is block that off by denying it in some superficial way because you can't entertain it. And what's happening there is the self and its emotions are really, if you like, causing your focus not to be able to leave you, not to be able to go beyond you, to relate, to engage. Another criterion, this is, I think, number 4. It's leaving a door to dialogue open. Okay, now you will have millions of examples where you were trying to talk to someone and they weren't talking to you, they weren't really opening the door, leaving the door open, you couldn't get a word in edgeways because they were so full of themselves, or for whatever reason. There are very ordinary examples you can see, like there's one that kind of I find particularly difficult is you go into a busy office, right? And there are 4 or 5 people working at computers there. And you go in and you're new to the building, you're new to the office, you don't know whom to approach. You go in, you stand there, somebody's talking to somebody else, somebody's just typing, everything is going on, nobody looks up at you. This is the William James not being noticed, freaky scenario, okay? So there simply dialogue isn't being allowed to begin because your existence is not being noticed. But it's horrible feeling that. You feel small, you feel made small by somebody who won't engage with you. you also have other ways of, probably more damaging ways of shutting doors to dialogue within intimate relationships, where one friend decides to tell you about something that you're doing to annoy people. Okay? And this is done with absolutely good intentions and out of kindness and care. So the person is being honest. But if that honest expression of that person's views is being put to you without allowing you to engage with them, it can be absolutely devastating. Because however kind the intention, what it's done is it's blocked you off. If you like, it's blocked your voice. It's shut you off. And this is, you can see this in other situations. You go juries pronouncing verdicts on criminals. What are you supposed to do if you're innocent, you know? And the jury says you're guilty. What are you supposed to do? You simply have no voice. What does it do? I can't imagine what it must do to you to be seen as not deserving to have a voice. And at smaller ways, it happens in everyday life too, you know, teachers or panels make judgments about students' work. But after a moment of dialogue, the judgment shuts off the door. Okay, you can't, I don't know, our society runs on this kind of institutionalized shutting of doors. It would take quite a lot of work to reopen and to change that kind of thing at the institutional level. One more example of this is some years ago, about 20 years ago, I think, I heard a program on the radio talking about powerless speech, women and powerless speech. And I didn't have the concept of that. I knew what they were talking about because suddenly I recognized it. It was this habit that apparently women have of ending sentences with, isn't it? Or don't you agree? Or don't you think? And I noticed how I was ending many, many official communications with, what do you think? Even though I really didn't want to know what they thought, but it felt too hard to end an email saying, this is what will happen, with a statement rather than an open door question. It felt kind of more polite and more respectful somehow, right? But women tend to do this, and women tend to kind of, in general, tend to get beaten back, as I understand it, from glass ceilings and all sorts of things, because of this use of a form of speech which qualifies or seeks agreement in order to go forward. But maybe what's happening here is it's powerless, but it's also very much a seeking engagement and a corroboration about views. You know, so it's kind of got very many differently. It's a keeping of doors open in powerless speech. Okay, appreciating the value of the other. So you've got to see the person as a person in order, I'm actually going to argue later, to be humble in some senses. But there are some risks in seeing the other, or indeed yourself, as a unidimensional whole person. There is a risk of misrecognition. Whether it's negative or positive, it can be actually very damaging. Let's take the troublesome student. You see this person, the student is bolshy, they're always making trouble, they're always late, blah, 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 blah. If that negative aura covers everything that they are, you don't see anything more in the person. So you're seeing the person unidimensionally, and that's not good. That can happen positively as well. So you see the wonderful lover, the person you've just fallen in love with, as a kind of through rose-tinted glasses, which are equally untrue and equally prone to misrecognition. And it bodes no good for anyone, neither the other person nor for you, to continue with this unidimensionality of the perception of the person. Same thing happens to the self. You win a prize, suddenly it goes to your head, and you think, I'm a superstar self, right? It's simply untrue. What's happening there is the one dimension is taking over the reality of the variety of aspects of self and the reality of different moments. You're becoming stuck, either in one dimension or out of time. And the same thing can happen very much more negatively with thinking of yourself as worthless. You make one mistake, you see yourself globally as, I'm a useless person, I'm just not bright, I'm just not good, or I'm a bad person, and so on and so forth. So there's a risk in seeing the other as a person as one unidimensional whole. There needs to be an acceptance of multidimensionality, of seeing the person present in the moment, although you do need to also go beyond that, as we will speak about at another point in time. And the last criterion that I want to talk about is attraction to difference. And this is important because there has been a lot of talk both in psychology and in philosophy about how the perception of similarity between yourself and another is absolutely crucial to getting on with the person, to understanding them, to having any kind of relationship with them. And I think although there's got to be a limit to how dissimilar a person can be before you can get on with them, the really crucial thing, and in my view, the starting point for dialogue is difference. It's not similarity. You're not. You need response to yourself from a different other whom you perceive as different and whom you are attracted to as different. Why do I say this? Okay, I'm going to give you some quotes from a couple of people which spell this out a bit. Martin Buber. Though the thou, he says, is not an it is also not another I. He who treats a person as another I doesn't really see that person, but only a projected image of himself. Okay? Now you can see this in infancy as well. Yes, infants recognize some degrees of similarity, bodily embodied similarity between self and other, but they're also very much aware of distinctions between self and other at birth and are attracted, if you like, to dialogue and response rather than similarity. Okay, so how do they say this at birth? Self-other recognition, differentiation at birth? Well, actually, yes. So there are different studies showing this, but one neat one, it's a very simple one, is you know that babies, when you touch their cheeks, newborn baby, you touch their cheeks, they open their mouth to root, right? So it's a kind of a reflex, a rooting reflex. You touch their cheek, they'll open their mouth to root. They accidentally touch their cheeks with their whole arm movements, and they don't turn their mouth to root quite so often or quite so much. They can tell the difference between the connectedness of their own body and the unconnectedness of this other body. So the distinction between self and other is not such a wildly difficult thing, even at birth. So it's already there. And certainly within the space of 2 months or 3 months, infants are able to engage in dialogue of saying different things, of having what they call proto-conversations, and in fact, of preferring other people's responses when they are responses rather than when they are imitations of what they themselves are doing. So something about difference is attractive. And I think it's attractive because it draws you in. It's like it touches on the almost known and it says, come and join me, come and be one of us, come and join the group. And that's, if you like, what happens in dialogue. You get drawn in. Now, a few more quotes. So dialogue needs response. Somebody else to respond to you and you to respond to the other person. It needs surprise. Okay? So Martin Buber says, for him, surprise was the essence of dialogue. And he says, for what I call dialogue, there is essentially necessary the moment of surprise. The whole charm of dialogue is that I do not know and cannot know what my partner will do. I am surprised by what he does, and on this surprise, the whole play is based. Imagine if you were having a telephone conversation with a friend was reading from a script. There would be no surprise somewhere, and the disjointedness of it would kill that dialogue quite quickly. Okay, and in conversations in general, in how conversations progress, you can't plan or prescript them. Here's a quote from Gadamer. We say, he says, that we conduct a conversation, but the more genuine a conversation is, the less its conduct lies within the will of either partner. Thus, a genuine conversation is never the one we wanted to conduct. Rather, it is generally more correct to say that we fall into conversation, or even that we become involved in it. No one knows in advance what will come out of a conversation. Understanding or its failure is like an event that happens to us. It allows something to emerge, which henceforth exists. Okay, and that's it for this part. Okay, so in this episode, we're going to talk about one small exploratory study that we did to look at what people thought of humility and openness and how and how they actually relate to each other as variables, if you like. So we did an empirical study using questionnaires with some closed questions and some open-ended responses sought from people. We sampled 431 participants from 3 countries, from England, from India, and from Spain. And we used mainly, we tapped into academic groups. So we used students and academic staff. So what was the purpose of this study? One purpose was to establish possible similarities, possible overlaps between how people perceive humility and how they perceive openness. Second, to explore in people's descriptions of humility what they saw of the emotional, the relational, and the everyday aspects of this phenomenon. Third, to establish possible relationships between emotional openness, intellectual humility, openness to experience, and hope or hopefulness. And fourth, to explore cultural variations. Now, we wanted to look at habits of openness and habits of social contact and how, if you like, they might make a difference in the way people think about humility and think about openness. So we chose these 3 countries for a reason. So we chose England, India, and Spain for a reason. So on the one hand, Spain and India are reported to have greater emphasis on an interdependent, more sociable, more socially connected style of living, kind of more family-oriented kind of style, in contrast to the UK, where this might be a bit less. Another reason is that both Spain and the UK have a common European kind of culture at some level, in contrast to India. So these 3 things are starting to pan out with pairing up with one another in different ways on different dimensions. And the third reason is, you could argue that both in the UK and in India, there is a common emphasis on hierarchy, which is obviously relevant to humility in some ways, as different from Spain, where this is apparently very much less the case. So these 3 countries seemed to capture some degrees of commonality in different ways with each other and some degrees of difference. And we were kind of interested, as an exploratory study, does this make a difference? How does it fall out? So the first question, you remember, was, do humility and openness relate to each other? So we had a humility and openness scale. And in relation to both of these factors, we didn't ask people, do you show traits of humility? Do you show or like being open, right? Because we figured that people answering questions about their own apparent humility or apparent openness has kind of got too many contradictions in it. You know, you can't be humble and say, I am humble. You could be open, but you may not know it. And it kind of is an uncomfortable way of getting at how do these 2 factors relate to each other. So what we did was we constructed a questionnaire where we asked people about people whom they like. So the starter question was, I like people who, and then we had all these different options, and you had to grade them in terms of how much you like people who show these qualities. So for the humility qualities, there were some questions which didn't relate to each other so well. It's called a composite reliability of 5 questions was really quite high. Okay, so these 5 questions, which seem to kind of capture and relate to each other as a package, were as follows. I like people who have the ability to acknowledge their mistakes and limitations. This is a kind of standard humility and intellectual humility factor. I like people who have an appreciation of value in all things. I like people who have no understanding of their own imperfections. There was a kind of a mixture of the positive and the negative phrasing of these questions. I like people who have an accurate opinion of themselves. I like people who like to feel superior to others. Okay, so these kind of formed one fairly tight package. And the composite reliability was 0.69, which is pretty high. Now, the openness questions within the same questionnaire were the ones which had this high reliability were as follows. I like people who feel others' emotions easily. I like people who have an open and receptive mind. I like people who are not afraid of negative emotions because they're a part of everyday life. I like people who enjoy experiencing the new. And I like people who see beauty where others may not. And these questions hung together in people's responses with an even higher composite reliability of 0.76. The highest you can get, by the way, is 1. So if you're getting above the 0.6s, you're getting into very, very high reliable territory. So the key findings from these studies were that openness and humility correlate actually reasonably well, which I'll tell you about in a second, that there were no dramatic differences between the countries in the way in which they described either intellectual humility or emotional openness. And third key finding was that hope, agreeableness, and neuroticism, which we also measured with little scales, are well predicted by openness and humility, but they are not. But openness to experience is not predicted by these two, which is interesting because openness to experience seems to be not about personal relations, and it seems to sit slightly differently from this kind of interpersonal openness or humility. So what we found was in the entire sample, the correlation between these humility items and these openness items was 0.8, which is really high. So the strongest relationship in India was a correlation of 0.82 between them. In Spain of 0.74, which is less, and in England of 0.69. And this kind of fit really neatly with our prediction of the more sociable, if you like, a culture seems to encourage its participants, its members to be. Perhaps it is the case that the more they will see these two things as being one and the same, or very close to each other. Maybe these two concepts blur and merge into each other more if your lifestyle is kind of very much more interdependent and social. We also in this questionnaire had open-ended questions about intellectual humility and about emotional openness. And people's responses were really rather nice. I mean, there were many everyday examples described, which were situation-specific in calling up what is humility. And certainly there were also some trait descriptions as well. Are you referring to people as he is definitely arrogant, or he is a humble sort of person, etc. But nearly 100% of them, of the descriptions that people offered of humility, were social descriptions of situations, and approximately 50% of these included emotional openness to the other. So there was, both in terms of the way in which they responded to the quantitative questionnaire and in terms of the way in which they gave examples, give me examples of humility or openness, there was a huge degree of overlap between them. Okay, let me give you a few examples of what people talked about to show this kind of overlapping characteristic of humility and openness. So here's a question that we asked people and we got them to write. Describe a situation where someone you know, not you, remember, it was always asking about other people, where someone you know showed intellectual humility. Okay, so here are some examples. A guest lecturer came to give a seminar on educational psychology, and this person has a PhD and many years of experience and has written many articles and books. During the seminar, she gave ultimate respect to everyone who asked questions and gave suggestions. She was open to queries during and after the seminar. She did not make us feel incapable, even though we were completely inexperienced in the field. Another one. A friend of mine heard me with utmost patience, even while in the middle of work. She gave me a sense of trust and of being cared for. So just look at the kinds of qualities that are coming up. Here's another one. My dad helped me through a tough time. He spoke to me empathetically and took the time to understand what was going on. And another one. I recently attended a seminar on leadership, and the guest speaker was so intellectually refined, such an awesome and enlightened speaker who touched every member present in the room with his speech. Okay, so there's something going on about reaching out and connecting. He was so humble, so friendly, that it created a great imprint on my mind. Okay, so there's again trust, caring, touching, friendliness, helping. Not things that you would see as necessary features of intellectual humility, but that's how they were coming up. So when we asked them in summary, when we collated descriptions of what is a humble person, sober, patient, grounded, humble, good listeners, non-judgmental. These were kind of terms that came up. They're calm, concerned, and reachable. They're genuine, honest, trustworthy. They're kind, respectful, clever, helpful, down to earth. Okay, so it's quite a wide variety of terms here, and not all of them are about thought. Many of them are about relating to other people, and a lot of them are about emotional attitudes of being in relation with others. Okay, so in this last part, we're going to talk about humility and openness to engagement. And I'm going to talk about just a few different things, mainly to conclude what we might think of as a relation between them, but also to broaden it out a little bit into two aspects that I haven't touched on very much before. One is kind of variations really in cultural practices which look very odd and very unhumble. In one example, touching feet. Another aspect I haven't touched on very much before is the kind of what might happen within a single encounter and changes, fluidity within the course of humility, if you like. Okay, so the first thing I'm going to talk about is this most central aspect of engagement, which I mentioned earlier, was seeing the other as a person. But it's a kind of a complicated thing, this seeing the other as a person. Yes, it involves necessarily a degree of unselving, of appreciation of the other's personness, of openness to dialogue with the other, and therefore to difference, and of involvement of yourself of some kind, in some way, in order to create the connection which allows what they called mutual sighting. Okay, it involves all of those things, but personhood, seeing the other as a person, has multiple levels and dimensions, and your seeing of the other person as a person could be of different aspects or levels of their presented selves. So you could grasp and process the other's words with recognition, think of them as a thinking and speaking person. You could ignore their intended communications and be overwhelmed instead by the emotion in their posture and demeanor. Or you could have a sudden insight into the motives and emotions that might have led to some of their ways and needs. So there could be, along very many different aspects or dimensions, this seeing the other as a person could occur. So it's not a simple thing. Your seeing of the other person could also range over time. So you could enjoy the warmth of their narrative in the moment, or remember the pain of their past, because you know it, or think of how great they could become if only, right? So how you engage, when you're engaging with them in all of these ways, but they could be split into different dimensions, and it's incredibly variable. Engaging with the other as a person and seeing the other as a person is really also not necessarily conscious. Little of engagement is actually, I think, a matter of conscious choice of focus. Your seeing is often gripped by the situation and by the other and by the events of the moments, as much as how you see them now grips what you do with them and how you engage with them. One other aspect of seeing a person as a person is always that it's always partial, there's a kind of indeterminacy in how we see people. Okay, so what does this mean? In a way, it's impossible that you can see someone at all levels and in all temporal dimensions at the same time. And so it's inevitable that your seeing of the other person is partial. It's always partial, maybe more or less partial. Some people have described this kind of relating to another as a kind of an uncontainable relation. Metcalfe, for instance, calls it the uncontainability of a second-person relation. He cites Levinas as saying, "You are you. In this sense, one can say that the face is not seen. It is what cannot become a content, which your thought would embrace. It is uncontainable. It leads you beyond." So it's kind of like a doorway, the you, the face, the person that you are seeing. And it's very close to what Sartre and others have termed indeterminacy in relations with persons. The person that you're seeing is never quite there fully. Not only can you not see the person fully, but the person themselves are always on the verge of becoming, to some extent, becoming what they're going to become in the next moment because of the way this engagement is going. It is kind of true. If engagement involves both, it creates, and in that creation, it also moves forward. It changes the people who are engaging. So it's kind of never quite pin downable. The other person is never quite pin downable. They're always open and they're always changing in the moment, depending on how you engage or not engage with them. Where does this leave engagement and where does it leave humility? Perhaps it's this partial seeing which is responsible for the plasticity and flux of engagement and what Buber called confirmation of the other person. In other words, confirmation of what they could be, rather than mere acceptance of what they are, right? So there's some kind of an almostness which is necessarily present in engagement. It's necessarily present in seeing the other person. And maybe it is necessary also for humility. I was going to give you an example of one more thing, of a single encounter which struck me very much when I experienced it. And it struck me as not only how impossible it is to separate humility from engagement sometimes in encounters, but it's also how quickly and how rapidly they can change with things that you don't normally think of as having anything to do with humility. This was an encounter with someone with whom I had had a disagreement, and someone I had been very close to, but with whom I'd had a very painful disagreement. And then there was a kind of a distancing and a separating and a cessation of contact, except sort of intermittent contact. At some point, the contact resumed because of circumstances and they necessitated it. The engagement after that contact resumed was initially not 100%. Certainly on my side, there were reservations and a kind of an unwillingness to completely let go. So there was a kindness, but there was some reserve. There was a formality. Until there was one occasion where the other person, the friend, was telling a story. And the story kind of, almost despite myself, got me laughing. And there was in that moment of laughter, there was a connection which it felt at that time as if I was suspending actually, I suppose you could call it an arrogant withholding of myself and letting go, despite the fact that we still didn't see eye to eye. Despite that fact, I suspended my arrogant withholding of myself and let go to allow engagement. Okay, so things go on and things change, but this kind of moment is not unfamiliar, I think, to most of us. And it kind of illustrates things can change for completely trivial, minor, unexpected reasons and make this contact. This contact is both engagement and it involves a kind of humility, of not getting stuck up yourself, as it were. There was just one more thing I wanted to talk to you about, which is this culture thing. I was at a wedding in India recently, and it was a grand society wedding and so on. But one aspect of it was both very familiar and unexpectedly moving, which is after the wedding, the bride and groom traditionally go together and touch the feet of all the elders. So somebody takes them along and they both bend down and touch the feet. And in one sense, you could see this touching of feet of these elders as a kind of abasement, accepting of a positional inferiority. They are older, so I have to touch their feet. And culturally, it isn't anything to do with abasement. But in another sense, it was very much of an attitude of respect for the fabric that they are all in. And I thought, is that humility? Is it not humility? It is certainly engaging with the fabric, but there is, in this acceptance of your part in a bigger fabric, there was such a powerful acceptance of not being special in yourself that you cannot bow your head. And I thought, yes, that is humility. I mean, you can call it just a cultural practice, and therefore it's not individual humility. Or you can call it's an institutionalized kind of humility, which when done with the right feeling is a powerful example of the different forms that humility can take. Okay, to sum up then. in many of our everyday interactions, it's often impossible to separate humility from engagement. They merge, they coexist as the same phenomena sometimes, changing from event to event within the same conversation sometimes. Our conceptions of each, however, differ. We think of humility more in situations of real or imagined conflict, differences of beliefs or opinions, dissonance of emotion, or inequality of status. The two terms are not synonymous, right? I mean, terms mean what they mean because of the way we use them, but we don't use them exactly synonymously. But nor are they entirely different substances or different relations, and it's unhelpful to think of the essence of humility as something different from the essence of engagement. What matters, I think, for our understanding of humility is that it is a fundamentally affective relational process, and it is really evident in the most ordinary of everyday instances. And to a large extent, the distinction between the two is one of situation and construction. So you might argue it's like a situational framing. In certain situations, this term becomes more applicable, in certain situations, the other. Okay? So they are kind of overlapping and indistinct and vague, but so close that thinking of them apart is you're losing the essence of both. Last point. I was thinking about unselving, and I was also thinking about sometimes when things go really well in engagement with another person, you're also unothering the person. You're not just thinking of me and just the other, but it could be that you're not just thinking of you and the other person, but you're thinking really of both in relation in a bigger fabric, of something beyond. Right? And maybe this something beyond is to a kind of a truth, a pattern that encompasses both. But I don't know whether unselving is enough as a description of humility or engagement. And I don't know whether unothering is enough either. And maybe that's a good place to stop this talking about humility. I don't know. I know they relate. I don't know quite exactly how.